Hello there, and welcome to the latest episode of Digital Foundry Direct Weekly. According to my notes here, the 192nd, not including specials. We're kind of winding up the year. You'd think the news would be slowing down, but it's not. Joining me to discuss it, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie, hello.
Yes, as always, Rich, a pretty relentless pace around here, and it should be a pretty jam-packed episode with quite a few contributors, hopefully, if all goes to plan, hopefully.
If all goes to plan, yeah. Yes. And hello, Tom Morgan.
Hello, yes, nice to be on again. Downing tools from the PS5 Pro testing here to join. Should be a good episode.
Hope so. Yes, we're going to have a rotating panel because, basically, we didn't have enough time really to do Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. So John and Alex are currently crunching on their content. It should be out by the time you see this, but they're going to be coming in to discuss a couple of our news topics. And with that, let's begin the show. But first of all, of course, a shout out to store.digitalfoundry.net, the home of our beautiful merchandising wares. So yes, please do check that out. But, well, with that, let's crack on. Okay then, December the 3rd, 1994, Sony released the PlayStation, and I think it's fair to say it's a console that changed everything. Now, joining me to discuss this particular topic, John Linneman, hello. 30 years of PlayStation, how did we get here?
As our resident lover of game history, I thought I would come on to talk about this because, so obviously this week Sony's been celebrating it themselves. They did release the 30th anniversary consoles and accessories, most of which are very difficult to get a hold of, unfortunately. I really wanted one of those PS5 Pros, but it didn't happen. But they've also done this dashboard thing, which we can talk about in a bit, where it sort of like brings back the history. But the thing about this PlayStation is, for those that are maybe too young, don't remember, you really have to rewind back to 1990s when the PlayStation was about to launch, like before December 3rd, 1994. Rich, you were covering games already for some years at this point, so you remember what the landscape was. I don't think any of us could have guessed that, the PlayStation is going to come in and essentially kick down the door, beating Nintendo and Sega at their own game within a generation. Like, it seemed impossible, right?
Well, from a retrospective point of view, because there were so many machines that were being launched in a similar period, you're quite right. It was basically almost Wild West territory, with everybody throwing in with their particular contributions, a vast range of machines. And of course, there was the Sega Saturn as well. There were established players entering the marketplace. Nintendo wasn't going anywhere. They were going to be coming up with their next generation machine a bit later on, but the Saturn was already there. But what I can say, John, is that there was momentum behind the PlayStation even before it came out. And this was due to developer goodwill. There was just speaking as a journalist at the time, you'd speak to developers and they were just only talking about the PlayStation. And so, yes, we've got this sort of weird situation where there were so many new machines coming in, but at the same time, the PlayStation was the one that everyone was talking about. I think it's fair to say. And then, of course, when, the import machines from Japan arrived and we saw Ridge Racer, and it was just a complete game changer.
Right. I think I highlighted this in my PlayStation launch retrospective video on DF Retro. It was like, when you look at other racing games that were shipping around the late 1994 period on any other console, they were not even remotely in the same ballpark. Like, it was generations behind, right?
Yeah.
Like, at this time, of course, you don't expect Sega, Mega Drive, or Super NES to compete. They had stuff like Virtua Racing and Stunt Race FX, which were cool for the platform. But then on the Atari Jaguar, you had, like Checkered Flag running at like 5 FPS with flat shaded polygons. The 3DO was doing okay with like Need for Speed and whatnot. That was very impressive, but it was still like a 15, 20 FPS game. So Ridge Racer showing up and resembling closely the arcade game, not exactly, but it looked good enough. It looked close, but it ran at a perfect 30 frames per second, which sounds like nothing today, but having a perfect 30 FPS 3D polygonal racer like that at launch was monumentally impressive. And Sega also failed to compete when they released Daytona USA, which obviously that's a slightly different game with 20 cars on screen or whatever, but it was a 20 FPS game, with a bad draw distance, right? Even though the game's great, it didn't compare well. And so you mentioned though before, like all these other consoles, like for people not really aware, like when you talk about the 93, 94, 95 period, beyond the main systems, right? Super NES and Mega Drive, this is when you had the 3DO. You had the Jaguar. You had Sega doing stuff like the 32X, the add-on. You had Nintendo with Virtual Boy. You had the Pippin Atmark from Apple and Bandai, right? You had FM Towns, the Fujitsu console. They had the FM Towns computers in Japan. They also made the console, the Marty. There was the Amiga CD32. The CDI was still kicking around somewhere. There was the NEC PCFX, which is a follow-up to the PC Engine, which was hugely successful in Japan. There was the Bandai Palladium, and then even stuff like the Casio Loopy, of course, with the 3DO before, Panasonic and Matsushita were involved in that as well. So all these big Japanese electronics companies, like pretty much all of them, were jumping in the ring, and there were still like Western developed machines in there as well, like the Jag, for instance, or the CD32. And like it was so messy at that period. And then you had the stalwarts, Nintendo and Sega, next gen machines coming, Sega's sooner than Nintendo's, of course. And Sony is the one out of that entire gigantic playfield that really got it right. And I think a lot of it stems from that whole very well known now debacle with Nintendo and Sony sort of like feuding over the CD-ROM technology, where, Sony made the sound chip for Super NES. They also were working with Nintendo on the CD-ROM drive, but I think over a royalty dispute, Yamauchi and co. decided to go with Philips instead, which was also a company that was involved in the creation of the CD-ROM format. And they kind of surprised Sony with it. It was kind of like betraying them, if you will. And then, of course, this led to the whole Kutaragi wanting to continue with PlayStation anyway and making something that was standalone, built by Sony to play Sony games. And really, I think his engineering team did an amazing job on the hardware for the time, but it was more like the way, like you mentioned earlier, they acquired the SN Systems stuff and Psygnosis to get the development environment sorted for Western companies, especially. They were really forward facing with game developers, from what I understand, like working with them. The hardware itself was easy enough to understand because 3D was really new, right? It was not an easy thing to wrap your mind around, the math and the work, just generating 3D polygons. But the PlayStation was about as simple a device as you could want at that time, making it easier to jump into than like the Saturn. And then, of course, the partnerships. They partnered with Namco, and Namco at that point didn't have the best relationship with Nintendo anymore. Owing to, they were one of the first licensees, if not the first, I can't remember. They were one of the first for Famicom, and I guess they had sort of an issue with Hiroshi Yamauchi that they didn't get as favorable treatment as they felt that they should have. So they kind of, it's a bit murky, but things between Namco and Nintendo were not the best. And so they partnered with Sony instead, including on arcade hardware even. And so all of a sudden, like all of Namco's big genre defining titles were coming out on the PlayStation. Because of that hardware connection with like the Tekken board, like you could basically get an arcade perfect version of Tekken at home. Like Tekken didn't look like Virtua Fighter 2, mind you, but you were still getting the arcade game in your house, which was nuts at the time. And it was a very good game, that whole series. So like all of these things together, plus just like having amazing software at launch, it just really created like this special thing. And it's like circumstances. They set up all the right dominoes just to push them down just the right time, and everything fell into place basically when you think about it.
Yeah, I just can't underestimate the whole developer buy-in thing, because, there were developers getting demos like a year before the machine came out, further back even than that. And they were just blown away. I think there was a CES where people just coming out of demos that Sony were running at a hotel and were just shaking their head at just how good it was. And at the same time, they were similarly saying, I just don't know how Sega are going to compete with this, because this is just on a completely different level. And, that kind of buy-in from developers, that kind of messaging permeated into the media. It's like Edge magazine at the time was just talking about PlayStation, consistently throughout that whole year, about how great it was. And then the release came out. It was all totally validated. And actually, looking back, the Saturn release came with Virtua Fighter 1, which was a pretty good port, a bit rough around the edges, but it was, it delivered. But then Ridge Racer comes out a couple of weeks later, full polygon 3D, consistent 30 frames per second, so consistent that many people thought it was running at 60.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is the power of good frame pacing, everyone. It just set the agenda. And you're quite right, the Namco stuff that was happening at the time, even the sort of what you might call what you might call second tier releases that nobody really remembers now, like Cyber Sled. We were eagerly awaiting that stuff, and we were lapping it up as it arrived. Namco just couldn't do any wrong at that time. And then, of course, Wipeout for the European launch. Absolutely amazing. This was just a whole class apart from anything we'd seen before. And obviously the 3D acceleration on PC was still a couple of years out, wasn't it? Rendition Verite was like 1996.
Yeah, like 96 is the year when that started to take off. Like there were 3D cars before that, but it was basically not used and they were very, very limited. And it was like Verite and then obviously 3D FX Voodoo. And those all kind of followed around a similar time frame as when the N64 launched, which was kind of like the era of texture filtering, as I like to say, where everything was filtered. In retrospect, I actually kind of prefer not filtered textures when they're that low res, because it does kind of smear a lot of detail, right? But it seemed super cool at the time. And then there was stuff like getting Squaresoft on board was a big deal.
Yes,
right.
The next big betrayal.
That was a gigantic sort of betrayal for them because Square had been a gigantic proponent of Nintendo platforms up to that point. They got all their success from Nintendo, and all of a sudden, both Square Enix and then eventually Enix as well. Like the next Dragon Quest was announced for PlayStation, even though it came out many years later. That was a big deal. Like everybody was just going to PlayStation. And like you said, I think this developer friendliness was important because at the time, like development manuals were complex and there wasn't that much support for game consoles. So like what Sega did with Saturn, I think was the norm for the industry up to that point. They didn't do anything necessarily wrong. They just did it the way that it had always been done. But I think with 3D and multi-processors, it's just so much more complex that it was, plus especially in the West, it seems like development hardware and debug stations and all this stuff was super rare. And like developers had to just go through unbelievable pains to get their games even working on Sega Saturn at the time. Sony was there like right away, like in the background before launch, like seemingly helping out as many developers as they could with here's how to work on the PlayStation basically. And it paid off big time for them. It's a great machine. I think the PlayStation is one of the best platforms that has ever existed. The amount of creativity, the amount of just incredible games in there. Even today, a lot of them hold up super well, like better than you'd expect. A lot of the cutting edge 3D stuff, maybe not so much, but there's some great stuff on there that's still a blast to play, especially the 2D or simple 3D stuff. You can't go wrong with it. And obviously that sort of paved the way for what would become PlayStation 2, which as well was a sort of a special thing in its own right. And I kind of miss this Kutaragi-led vision for PlayStation in this like period of unbridled creativity where games were still affordable enough to make, that developers were able to just do whatever the heck they wanted. This has kind of been replaced with indies, I would say. But back then it was like this combination of CDs, which were cheap to manufacture, with just like the smaller budgets of the time. Like people could just get together and create whatever the heck they wanted. And they sure created some weird stuff for PlayStation, which was part of the charm, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing, of course, is that the whole marketing and exclusivity tie-ups they did just kept on bringing rewards across that entire generation. Obviously, there are key titles there. You've highlighted a few of them. Another one, of course, was Tomb Raider 2. Saturn had Tomb Raider 1, of course, but the PlayStation had the better version.
Big time.
And then, of course, they just tied up Tomb Raider for pretty much the rest of the generation. So there's a lot of examples of that where, they just didn't really put a foot wrong.
Resident Evil as well.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. That was pretty amazing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the Namco stuff just kept on coming throughout that generation. Soul Edge, etc., and Ace Combat.
They needed that stuff too, because like 3D fighting games were pretty big, and like that was one area where Sega Saturn was absolutely awesome. I think we can agree. Like Sega's ports of like Virtua Fighter 2 were legendarily good, and Namco was there to compete with them with their excellent conversions of Tekken games. Like I think Tekken 3 is just unbelievable on there, how close it comes to that arcade game. And it just looks and plays like a dream. N64 was the odd man out there. It really did not have a good fighting game library in comparison.
Right. Yeah. So, what should we talk about next? Let's talk about the update they've made to the PlayStation 5 system software.
Yeah, that's fun.
It's like a 30th anniversary celebration where you update the system software and it kicks off with the classic intro sting from the original PlayStation, which is pretty neat, I think. And then you've basically got, I wouldn't call them dynamic themes, but you've got themes that represent each of the major PlayStation generations. You can basically swap the wallpaper.
So I actually have a little bit of an issue with that because I feel like they could have done it better. Like the way they like overlay like a static layer on top of the other wallpapers looks a bit odd, I think. And I like the sound effects stuff. I think that's brilliant. But I feel like it would have been better if they could have made a dynamic 3D background similar to what the default PS5 background is, but duplicating the background that you expect from, like, imagine for PS2 you would have not just those cubes, but like that clock. Remember, you go to the system config on PS2, it has that gorgeous crystal clock made out of like weird glass-like material, and then they used depth of field on it to make it look really fancy, which was like the first PS2's first console with depth of field blur, we should say. That would have been such a freaking cool background for the PS5, and they just didn't do anything that dynamic in the end, which is a bit of a shame, but it's still a fun idea. I like the sound effects, especially. Like, I think the PS2 menu sound effects actually really suit the PS5 somehow.
Yes.
Like, it still sounds contemporary.
Yeah, I mean the whole aesthetic of the PS2 front end actually sits really nicely on PlayStation 5.
God, PS2, man, just aesthetically, just an amazing machine. Like, from the hardware design, the menu system, like everything about the packaging, like the whole thing from back to front just has this like feeling of classiness to it that I don't think they've ever quite the PS5s may be close, but the PS2 is just a beautiful piece of hardware. I think I love that design aesthetic so much. Yeah,
I mean, I love the concept of being able to access those old user interfaces, and it just goes to show how great Sony is at UI. The XMB even on PS3 I think was pretty great. PlayStation 4 and 5 I'm not such a big fan of. But I guess necessarily things started to get a bit more complicated on.
I think they're fine enough for what they are. PS4 especially was pretty good, but none of them have quite that style of the Kutaragi era consoles. Where you really felt super slick in a super cool way.
Let's talk about DF Retro, John, because we've actually got a new episode coming. It should actually be live now by the time this one goes public, and. It's a really interesting concept. It's basically, what if Digital Foundry existed in 1994 with access to all of the tools that we've got today?
Right.
And we've actually done the first of an infrequent series, I think we should say, which is going to be stacking up the Saturn against the PlayStation at a time where platform comparisons were very, very different to how they are today.
Oh, yeah. Big time. Yeah, so the first episode that will be going up here is essentially racing and driving games, vehicle-based games. There was a lot of them shared between Saturn and PlayStation, if you recall, and it goes through launch period up through about 1998, I think, right? I think like that NASCAR game from EA was one of the last ones. So EA was still there for a while.
Yeah.
And then I feel like it just shows the sort of evolution and also kind of gives you insight into what was going on with these systems at the time. You often heard Saturn was weaker at 3D. And this kind of gives you insight into why people thought that way. I think the Saturn could actually do pretty awesome 3D. It's just that it often didn't. And it was specifically because big games receive what I would say bad ports. Like one of the first ones I talk about is Wipeout, which is a seminal game on PlayStation. Came to Saturn running at 2/3 the frame rate, 20 FPS instead of 30, and with reduced quality on all the visuals, I would say. It's just a muddier looking game, lower color palette for the textures. All the effects are pared down. It's just less good looking. And this was the case for both of the Wipeout games that released on Saturn. So, which is unfortunate. It's those Psygnosis ports in general, I think so that's what's interesting. Sony owned Psygnosis at this point, but Psygnosis retained the option to release their games on other platforms, I guess. Or, other publishers would publish them besides Sony, but we got Wipeout, 3D Lemmings, Destruction Derby, and the like on Saturn, but they were all much, much worse. So I almost wondered, like, is this like a weaponized porting? Where you're like, did they allow this to make the Saturn look bad?
Didn't you unearth some Sega paperwork where they basically weren't happy with the quality of those ports and didn't? Really
that was in that leaked fiscal year document stuff that came out a while back that gave insight into what Sega of America was doing. And they identified issues with those Psygnosis ports. They knew. They were like, this is not good, guys. we gotta do something about this. Unfortunately, they were not able to do something about this. They also mentioned that Destruction Derby 2, I think, was planned for Saturn as well, which is a really great game, but that did not happen, obviously.
I think the bottom line is that the 3D on the Saturn was, a totally alien concept compared to the deployment of 3D on PlayStation. So to do a port was actually far more onerous than you might imagine. It was all quads versus triangles and all of that sort of malarkey. Also the VDP2 situation, where you've basically got an entirely different layer in the background that runs independently. So you actually found situations where the background was running at a higher frame rate than the foreground. That was always foreground funny. 3D. Yeah, crazy stuff. So, 30 years of PlayStation, and we're hoping to, quote-unquote, celebrate it in our own way with that TF Retro episode, which was never intended as a 30th anniversary episode. It's just...
No, not originally.
Just the one that we've got ready to go.
But it kind of worked out, right? I mean, I knew it was the 30th anniversary, and it seemed like the right time to work on this video. But now that we're here, it's like, this is the right time to put it out. So,
and it was extremely difficult to actually do stuff like frame rate analysis from analog sources.
Oh my gosh, it is a gigantic pain. It takes a lot of work. Especially when dealing with situations like the aforementioned multi-plane background stuff, like with VDP2.
Yeah, we had to kind of crop the images so the background wasn't involved in the calculations.
Even if, let's say, the background and the foreground were both running at like 20 or 30 FPS, sometimes they'd actually be out of sync. So you'd have like one frame update, but then the next frame update would just be the background layer. But then the 3D would update the next frame, and then the background layer again. And so like the tools would see that as 60 frames per second because the image is changing every...
But your eyes would say otherwise.
But your eyes would say otherwise. And it's because of that the stuff going out of sync. So that was not fun. But it is the results are super interesting, I think. So please give it a look if you haven't already.
Okay. With that, let's move on. Okay, so this is an interesting news topic. This week, for the first time in many years, Valve has updated its branding guidelines, which in theory doesn't sound particularly exciting, does it? However, one of the branding guidelines includes a new logo, which is powered by SteamOS. And basically there's a slight explainer to it. This powered by SteamOS sticker will be attached to hardware that's running the SteamOS operating system, implemented in close collaboration with Valve. Now, at the moment, of course, the only official devices that use SteamOS are the Steam Deck and the Steam Deck OLED. So obviously, this kind of hints that there is going to be further hardware coming that does indeed use SteamOS. Obviously, imagination is running riot amongst pretty much everybody who's seen this label. But Oliver, I'm kind of curious where you sit on this. What do you think we're going to be seeing? More handhelds? Some kind of return of the Steam machines even?
Oh,
what do you reckon?
I hope all the above. I hope all the above. Certainly when you look at this branding, a hardware device will run the SteamOS and boot into SteamOS upon powering the device. And they'll have some Steam image in collaboration with Valve there. I think it certainly does sound like something that would be a really good fit potentially for portable consoles, or rather for handheld PCs as they're called. I think it would be a really great fit for a device like the ROG Ally for the Legion Go, any upcoming handhelds in that ilk, having an officially supported variant of SteamOS by Valve. I think it would work great for those machines, but I also think it would work really well for Steam machines. I'm not sure if they would go all out with the Steam machine branding this time, or if they would just offer it as like a pre-install on otherwise Windows-powered PCs. You kind of think it might be both approaches might exist there, and you might have some dual boot functionality. I really am not 100% sure where they'll go, but it does seem very exciting to me that they're embracing some kind of third-party commercialization of SteamOS, because SteamOS rocks. It just solves so many issues. End-to-end interface, great controls over any number of gaming relevant settings, frame rate caps, FSR, upscaling modes, TDP, system settings tweaks, connecting controllers, connecting Bluetooth devices. It's all done through this great interface. You never have to dip into that desktop Linux or any kind of desktop interface, which does not operate very well with a kind of couch controller setup there, or with a kind of portable controller setup there. They solve shader comp with Fossilize. They solve driver issues by installing new AMD drivers with new device updates. So if they can bring a lot of that functionality to third-party devices with SteamOS, I think that's great. And performance, I tested performance with Bazite on the Asus ROG Ally, and it was very, very similar. Between Windows and SteamOS, very, very similar. You might lose a couple frames here and there in some titles, but it's quite comparable. And ray tracing support is there. Obviously, I've tested that in the past year or so, but it's there, and it seems to be getting better all the time. So in general, games that have ray tracing capabilities are supported within SteamOS. You can run them, and you can run them in a performant manner on that hardware. So I think all the stars are aligned for hopefully what will be a beautiful set of hardware launches here in the next year or so. I'm hoping that's going to be the case, because I think this is a super exciting prospect for a proper couch and portable PC gaming experience. I think this is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got this question here from Jack D. Jack. Howdy gents! ! Given Valve has recently updated their guidelines for distributing products with SteamOS, or even just a Steam client, it appears the Steam machine dream is back from the dead. My question for you, do you think Valve can truly put it off this time? In theory, it feels like Valve has achieved with Steam what Microsoft desperately wants out of the Xbox brand. With the decline of Xbox market share, can Valve finally achieve its dream of pulling the rug out from under Microsoft and take their spot in the gaming hardware Triforce? Or is the prospect of a computer connected to a TV still just not as appealing as a dedicated gaming box with more familiar branding, let alone a PlayStation 5 or Switch? I worry Valve's UX and price to performance just won't be able to compete with Sony or Nintendo, leaving PCs still far more biased towards the desk. Tom, does the concept of a PC running SteamOS connected to a TV appeal? I mean, Jake D. Jake is talking here about essentially challenging the consoles. Do you think that's basically what Valve's trying to do here?
I think they have a good shot at it, because they're in a different position now compared to where they were when they first launched Steam Deck. There's a lot more brand they've got a lot more pull with that brand, and it makes sense as well, given the way the market is steering. PS5, and Series X are ever more becoming more like PCs in the way that they're being treated, and I think there's a bit more market sense in leaning that way.
This is a really interesting one from my perspective because things are changing, certainly for Microsoft. We're looking at this sort of transitionary period where they're absolutely almost, well, what can I say? The concept of Windows and Xbox kind of merging does, in some way, does seem likely. But Valve just seem to actually have the problems all sorted. I mean, we've talked on the Direct a lot of times about the amount of issues that that Microsoft has got with Windows. And as you pointed out, Oliver, a lot of them seem to be comprehensively addressed. Fundamental issues with Windows gaming just seem to be sort of sorted out by Valve. It's kind of weird that it's taken that Valve to do it and Microsoft are left behind. At the meantime, they've kind of sorted out the concept that you can have a PC that has a desktop interface, but that desktop interface is kind of tucked away in the background. And first and foremost is the interface that you need for like console style gaming. But at the same time, it's got PC style features like frame rate caps and, other performance enhancing features just built into the dashboard there, which I think is really, really cool. Are they challenging PlayStation and Switch? I kind of think that's probably a much longer term objective. I think in the short term, it's simply about taking the fact that they've got the dominant brand in PC gaming. Steam is essentially unchallenged at this point, and they're taking Steam out of the PC ecosystem, or rather expanding the PC ecosystem to kind of branch out into handhelds and possibly even Steam machines. I think the Steam machines thing would be really interesting, but you are going to be facing cost challenges there against PlayStation 5, certainly. At the moment, they're selling PlayStation 5s for like £400 in the UK, which, the concept of being able to get a Steam machine for the same price seems, unless Valve actually enters the console space itself, which is a possibility, but I don't know. What do you think, Oliver, about that? Obviously, they've made custom silicon with AMD. Do you think they could do it again for a home console? Do you think they're even interested in that?
I guess the question would be like, is there something that's on AMD's roadmap that would be appropriate for them if they wanted to go down that route of a unified SoC that might be competitive there? And I think there is a product, if you look at AMD's roadmap, that would be appropriate. It's escaping my recollection right now, but the 40CU part, obviously. Strix Halo, exactly. Looks very, very appealing. Yes. Potentially very, very appealing for a little nice console box that you'd have in your living room that would sit in place of an Xbox or a PlayStation 5 and give you a very console-like experience. For a console-like price tag, maybe not. Probably not too much more, I'd have to imagine. But I kind of, I don't know, I kind of look at this a little bit differently, where I don't really think Valve needs to conquer other console platforms, potentially home console platforms. I don't think they need to conquer PC gaming in the same way that the Steam Deck didn't need to beat Switch to be a success, right? Selling a number of millions of units, perhaps single digits, millions of units for Steam Decks was a success, I think, for Valve. I don't really think that Valve needs to have a mega successful hit that blows Sony out of the water here in order for it to be a good machine for them. And I think there are a lot of people who have big Steam libraries, who want a console-like experience out of PC hardware, who maybe want a bit of a higher end or more configurable experience with their game playing experience, as opposed to consoles which are often, fairly set back in that respect. I think that there is probably a market for this kind of device, and I don't know exactly how big that market is, but I think that Valve would be really, really well positioned to approach that market and deliver people a product that actually would really, really work for a kind of console gaming experience with PC components.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the concept of just having SteamOS made ready for a sort of console-like device brings into play people like Alienware and Asus and Lenovo. They can actually make those devices. The fact that they're PC, you can actually, obviously sell them at a PC style price point. You don't need to specifically target PlayStation 5. And obviously in the past, we've seen things like, I think it was the Alienware X51, which was a very console-like box, but was built on PC components. I love that device. I thought it was a really cool looking thing. That old Alienware Alpha, which was this tiny, tiny little device, that was pretty cool, but a bit underpowered. There's a lot of potential there. For sure. I think in the short term, though, it's more likely to be the case that we're going to be seeing stuff like possibly like a SteamOS edition of the new ROG Ally or the new Lenovo Legion device. That probably seems a bit more likely. But, the stars, as you say, Oliver, the stars are kind of aligning. It's all looking pretty good. And I think of all of the people who should be worried, it's probably Microsoft, because they seem to be trying to do a similar thing, but they seem to be years behind.
Microsoft has the ambition, but Valve has the product. It's my suspicion here. Because I think they're basically there with the product, I would suspect, at least if they are pretty deep into their SteamOS integrations with third-party manufacturers. And like you see the kinds of updates that Valve is pushing to GameScope, and it's all positioned around functionality that the Steam Deck does not currently have, like VRR, for instance. I think if you read the tea leaves from the past few months of like GameScope updates, you can see, okay, they're preparing for something that is broader than their current Steam Deck effort, and I would presume that would involve some of what's going on here.
I think there's something else as well, which is that the console manufacturers need to kind of sort out the whole competition angle, because the concept that games are so expensive on Xbox and PlayStation stores, and then at the same time you have PC where you have genuine competition and where you have those Valve Steam sales, which are just so compelling. That's something they've got to kind of get to grips with, I think. And I think on a more general level, the issue that I have with SteamOS at the moment is I think it needs to be a lot easier to plug in games from like your Epic library and stuff like that. Has there been any movement on that, Oliver? You're keeping up with all of this sort of stuff. Is that something that's happening?
That's interesting. I've not seen any movement on that from Valve in particular. I know there have been a lot of third-party efforts to make that process a little bit more streamlined. I mean, to me at least, this is a smaller hassle. Getting this set up is a one-time problem than having to deal with Windows on a desktop every single day when you're actually using a device. I'd venture that's less of a hassle.
Okay, well, at the moment, we've only got like powered by SteamOS branding as a kind of hint at what is to come. But I'm certainly going to be interested to see how this story develops. But with that, let's move on. Okay, so obviously this year we've had a massive release from Infinity Ward and Activision and indeed Microsoft with the release of Call of Duty Black Ops 6. And we're going to be covering the game on PlayStation 5 Pro, I think, pretty soon. Tom's done a lot of preparatory work on that. But Tom, you also had the chance to go to Poland to visit Infinity Ward's tech hub and to get some visibility on the tech enhancements that have been made to the Infinity Ward engine. And man, I mean, I've done a couple of these visits in the past, and you always come back with your head kind of buzzing with all of this vast amount of information that they impart. But essentially, I think one of the fantastic things about the Call of Duty engine is that every year they're iterating, they're improving, they're adding new features. They still manage to get these games running on a base PlayStation 5 and Xbox One. But this time, you took the trip, and we've got content to come, but come on, tease us with some of the stuff that's in the pipeline there.
Oh, I'll try not to give like everything away. I think that's the challenge with this one. But yeah, as you say, you kind of your head spinning with so much information by the end of the trip because, well, you know, it's. I went to see Infinity Ward Poland and spoke to Michał Drobot, who's their principal rendering engineer. Kind of principally, it was a look at what they were doing with PS5 Pro. I think that was the lead-in, really, just to know, you know, new hardware. You know, it's a good opportunity to catch up, but also a springboard to actually just see, okay, here are some of the engine innovations since we last saw each other. And, you know, I last saw him in Santa Monica, in the Infinity Ward Santa Monica studio for the original Modern Warfare reboot. And that was very illuminating for a number of reasons. They had a lot to show with that sort of reinvention of the series. And again, like, you know, it's iterative at this point, but they keep on pushing this engine. They keep on driving forward the optimizations behind the scenes. And a lot of them, you know, honestly, doing the tech reviews, you get a surface level look at the game, but you never really understand what's going on under the hood. And it does make you appreciate on a whole other level, what lengths these engineers and developers go to make this work. It's not a trivial matter to get a game running at 60 frames per second, or even targeting 120 FPS with 120 hertz displays, having it so cross-platform scalable as it is, even going down to Xbox One, as you say. Even though there are mixed results with Black Ops 6, as we found there, but it's still impressive that it's even feasible, and that it's it's balanced in a way for gameplay's sake to work across platforms online. So as you mentioned, I've done a bit of digging with the Black Ops 6 Pro enhancements, the patch, and there's a lot, there's some cool stuff in there. There's some upgrades. I think I touched on it briefly. There's a push to improve global illumination. There's improved AO, shadows, and reflections as well, with varying degrees, if I'm being honest, of perceptible difference. But the biggest difference, I think, was in the GI. You can usually see in side-by-side shots flipping between the two. There's a definite change in the way light hits, and the way there's a kind of occlusion around objects now. When light hits something, there's actual shadow and light bounce behind an object. Where on PS5, there'd be light leak, as they call it, around an object. So that's nice to see, but it's sort of stuff that works best in comparison when you flip between two images and then you see really actually what the impact is. There's the 60 hertz mode on PS5 Pro, which is now using PSSR, and I think there's a move there to optimize the performance, but also there have been noted downsides, I think, in some quarters of forums looking at the visual changes on PS5 Pro, where they've noticed there's some artifacts introduced with PSSR. And I spoke to Mikhail Drobot about this. He said, they've noticed it, and he in fact said he fixed it in half a day. It's but as it stands right now, I think as of publishing this this direct, it still stands. It's on patch 1.05. I tested it yesterday as of that latest patch, and it appears as these white dots that appear across there's kind of this main base area in Black Ops 6 that you return to, and there's this kind of a headquarters with all the locations dotted around a map. You select your mission from that, and you can see these speckled artifacts kind of dotting around the screen, especially when you move. And the reason they're there, it turns out, is that the PSSR technology works as an anti-aliasing method, but not especially well as a denoiser. Whereas their native IW engine anti-aliasing method actually is a good denoiser. It's custom equipped to tackle all the rendering noise that goes along with their VRS, their variable rate shading, their shadows, their SSR. All these components in the pipeline generate some noise in the final buffer that is then cleaned up with the denoiser. PSSR does not really do that very well in its current implementation anyway. So they found a way to fix it, but from speaking to them, it seems like it needs to pass through cert, it needs to pass through QA first, so it'll be coming down the line. But yeah, for now, that's still in place. But yeah, there's a bunch of upgrades in there, which I'm kind of excited to talk about beyond that.
Okay, yeah, it sounds interesting. I mean, I guess what we're seeing there with PSSR is yet another example of, if you talk about Infinity Ward's anti-aliasing and upscaling, they've been iterating on that since, Infinite Warfare? So you've got basically years of legacy code integrated into that engine that's just been getting better year on year. And so the concepts that, a brand new upscaling and anti-aliasing technology can just be inserted, providing immediately better results, it's not really a given. that's kind of how much in time investment is going into these upscaling solutions, not just in the Call of Duty engine, of course, but also in Unreal Engine 5. I think that was the big takeaway we had from Silent Hill 2.
Yeah.
It was just better to go back to TSR than to use PSSR at this point in time. At least Epic didn't even integrate PSSR to begin with for Fortnite. Yeah, interesting stuff. So what else is kind of bubbling on in the pipeline there that you can talk about?
There's a talk about how the 60 hertz mode has a cool new feature in the form of VRR support, which is essentially it's an interesting approach to kind of optimizing the frame times. And they have, if you have a VRR display connected while in the 60 hertz mode, it enables you to go above 60 FPS essentially, and there's a read that goes above it. And the approach there is very much like it's predictive. It's Mikhail explained it. They take the last 50 to 100 frames, and based on the rendering load and how much what they call slop is in the because obviously it takes 16.7 milliseconds to render each frame in a 60 FPS game, they see how much is actually left over in the last 100 frames, and then work towards pushing out a frame in, say, 12 milliseconds if it's able to do so, which maximizes the speed at which you can make an input from the controller, and they generate a frame faster. So it's kind of predicting based on previous frames what to do with the next few frames. And yeah, so you can get up to, I did a few tests on it, 70 FPS, 80 FPS in the 60 FPS mode. So that's really cool. There's also improvements with, I'm not sure if this is used very much, but the split screen mode, because of the just general improvements in the hardware on Pro, they were very keen to stress, the split screen mode actually works pretty well now. Something I've got to check actually myself, but that is something that's worth looking at. But beyond that, tech improvements generally to the engine, there's just a lot of stuff just going on under the hood. And they really have they have a kind of torture chamber, as they call it, with every single rendering technique that they use in the engine kind of laid out in this sort of beautiful virtual space, all with these labels across the floor. Like there's one for the volumetric fog, there's the SSR, there's the grass draw systems, there's just everything you can imagine under the sun. And so they had stuff like WGV, weather grade volumes, which basically means that they show this off in the first level of the campaign, but it's a new system that lets you kind of walk into water or snow, and it leaves kind of a mark across the player's body after you've kind of left the puddle. And it uses voxels kind of as a grid of sort of 8x8 voxels in a cube space, which lets them see where on the player's body that water should hit and how long it should persist for. And it's something that I think a lot of players will just completely miss, when they play the game, but it's actually just a new thing that kind of worked its way, and it's a more effective way that they're doing it. Stuff like more advanced glass, you like chip into glass on like multiplayer maps like Skyline, and you can see there's actual definition to where you make the shot, and it actually breaks procedurally down depending on where you shoot. So there's a lot of really subtle stuff, but it takes a lot of thinking to get right, and it's all kind of additive to what they're trying to do with the engine.
Okay, well, I'm going to look forward to that video. Hopefully there'll be some teaser assets that you could include in this little bit as well.
Yeah.
But obviously Call of Duty's massive technology investment there from Activision. And what can I say? I just think it pays off. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so this week, Intel broke cover. The Intel Arc B580 is a thing. It is real, as is the B570. It is indeed... Intel's attempt to crack the kind of mainstream market. $250 confirmed, 12 gigabytes of frame buffer memory confirmed. better performance than RTX 4060. They're mooting that. Last week, we were suggesting that maybe they could challenge the 4060 Ti, which would be amazing to do at $250. Now, interestingly, I'm looking at Intel's own benchmarks for this, and they actually have a slide here which has a kind of breakdown against the 4060 across a whole bunch of games. There's some games, a minority based on Intel's benchmarks, that are actually going to be slower. Starfield, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Robocop Rogue City, Gears 5, that one's interesting, Counter-Strike 2. But, it's still there or thereabouts. And then they've got a much longer line of games where they're either on par or more typically faster. Their average is that they suspect they're going to be 10% faster than NVIDIA RTX 4060. That's at 1440p Ultra. As to how they've configured that, whether that's native resolutions or whether it's using upscaling, I think it might be using upscaling. I'm not sure. We're going to have to validate this with testing. But this is looking potentially quite exciting. And they're looking at these results here. They actually have up to 43% faster than Cyberpunk 2077. Now, that would be very, very interesting, bearing in mind that in my testing, Cyberpunk is highly tuned for NVIDIA hardware, specifically with ray tracing. So maybe that's not using ray tracing. Who knows? But yeah, this is looking quite exciting at this point. Oliver, you've been following this story. Mm-hmm. There's some interesting stuff here. It's potentially, we've got a supporter question here, which kind of gets to the point. And it comes from Retro Sean. Do you think that the second generation of Intel discrete graphics will have more of an impact this time? Well, I think it will have more of an impact. The question is whether it's enough to make people just, even for a second, consider not buying the 4060, which is selling in like gigantic numbers at this point.
Yeah, I kind of think it will have more of an impact if just because of that price point and the fact that you're looking at 12 gigabytes of VRAM for that higher end card or 10 gigabytes of VRAM for the lower end card for $30 less. That's a really compelling prospect, especially when we start to look at games that are very VRAM heavy, even now, like Indiana Jones, apparently. And the price here is certainly the right price. I think probably the question in a lot of people's minds will be, are the drivers good enough? I noticed that Tom Peterson has been doing the rounds talking about how much the drivers have improved and how good they are now. I don't know if that's true at the moment. I'd probably be happier with an AMD or an Intel card in terms of that driver compatibility for new titles. But if they can get the driver compatibility up to a good level there, that will certainly be very, very interesting. But one element that I am a little bit intrigued by and slightly concerned about is die efficiency. Because the die they're using for these new cards, apparently, it's 272 millimeters squared on TSMC 5.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I was at the presentation. They did confirm that.
Yeah, that's way bigger than 80-107, which is the GPU that's used for the RTX 4060 there, which it's not enormously faster than, like Rich said, 10% faster than that card. And it's almost as big as AD104. Which is 294 millimeters squared, which is a much more powerful GPU. That's in the RTX 4070, for instance. Now, one element that does throw a little bit of a wrench in this is the memory interface is substantial at 192 bits. Memory interfaces have tended not to scale as well on newer process nodes, but the density to me is still pretty low. That's probably not good for Intel's margins. Probably not that good as well for mobile products. It's also a little bit power inefficient at 190 watts relative to NVIDIA there, where like the 4060 Ti is, I think, 160 watts, and it's more performant. But relative to AMD, I think it's pretty decent power efficiency, so I don't want to knock them too much for that. It's just something to note there. But yeah, I am very interested in this card. I'm also very interested in what they're doing with XeSS2, which perhaps we can talk about a bit more. But I think the hardware here, it's very, very compelling for $250 if the drivers can be right. There are some elements that to me are a little bit concerning, but probably got a lot less concerning for $250 for a 12 gigabyte card that is faster than a 4060. So that's my basic take.
So yeah, it wasn't just about the hardware that they were discussing. They were also talking about new software. They've increased the utility of their overclocking, which doesn't particularly interest me, to be honest. I kind of think overclocking is kind of dead at this point. Maybe there will be some kind of small performance bump that you'll be able to get out of this. I don't know, but typically in the era of boost, you're getting most of the silicon's sort of performance anyway. But more interesting is the fact that they are now deploying their own version of frame generation. Unlike the AMD solution, it is using machine learning. And so, yeah, it is a part of XeSS, XeSS2. There's not really much that's given away about that, though. We're just going to have to test it, at this point. I think the problem with coming in so much later than DLSS, and FSR3 has had the same problem. The issue is that game take-up is kind of laggier compared to DLSS3, which is, effectively the standard for frame generation. If a game is going to have frame generation, it's going to support DLSS3, and you might get FSR3. So where does that leave XeSS? It's even sort of further behind. Hopefully there'll be some kind of unification push, similar to the way that there is happening for super resolution. Going back to the die-sized stuff that you were talking about there, Oliver, it's, you're quite right. The memory controllers aren't particularly scalable. Yeah, and I also think that the route that they're taking with AI acceleration may be quite inefficient in terms of die area versus NVIDIA. But, that's all sort of speculation at this point. What can I say? I wish Intel well here. I'm going to be reviewing the card. In fact, I've got it. It's on my test rig over there, which I'm just setting up to test this at the moment. And also of interest, I guess, is the fact that they do actually have an even cheaper offering coming. And that is the B570. So the spec reductions there, you're getting 18 Xe cores rather than 20 in the B580. But otherwise, small reduction on XMX AI engines, small reduction on graphics clock, very, very small there. You're still getting 10 gigabytes of memory and memory interface down to 160 bits versus 192 from the B580. And again, the power requirement goes from 190 watts down to 150 watts. Both B580 and B570 will have PCIe X8 interfaces using one PCIe 8-pin power input. Looks pretty good there. And I'm kind of interested about this B570. We're not going to be seeing it until January. But I do remember, looking back at the first generation ARC cards, the only real difference between the A750 and the A770 was the memory allocation, 8 versus 16 gigabytes. Those cards were very, very similar. In fact, some games actually benched identically, which is quite staggering. So I'm wondering, the B570, I think it's going to come in at 219. So that could be even more of a value champion, which is kind of nuts. We'll just have to wait and see. Exciting times there. I just think that the problem Intel are going to be facing is that, everything in the sort of mainstream market is kind of driven by market perception, and market perception is driven by the Halo products, and they haven't got one, at least not at this time. So, it's typically the fact that, an RTX 4090 comes out, it's defined as the best of the best, and then everybody thinks NVIDIA is the best and just buys the card that they can afford. It's a strategy that's worked time and time again. And I'm really going to be interested to see whether this can actually make any kind of difference. But on paper, at least, it just looks like a much better product. And certainly for the games that we like, the higher end AAA titles, that's where the B580 is significantly outperforming the 4060. So, bring it on. I can't wait to test it. But with that, I guess we should just move on. Okay, next news story. I'm kind of excited by this one. Lenovo Legion Go. It's a really nice handheld. It's frankly huge, though. It's not particularly attractive, I don't think. But the successor, or at least potentially one successor, has been leaked. The Lenovo Legion Go S. It looks like a much more conventional looking handheld. And it's going to be using the Z2 architecture from AMD. And well, Oliver, you've seen the same leak that I have. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and very cool device. So one thing I really like about this device, this new Lenovo Legion Go S, is the physical design. Those grips are really something that I think you do miss on the ROG Ally and a bunch of other handhelds. In fact, I keep ordering these bizarre sets of 3D printed grips from China to try to get more of a grip on that ROG Ally device, and none of them have been to my satisfaction thus far, so perhaps this is a better route there. But I think if you're going to make a 7 or 8 inch handheld, this is rumored to have an 8-inch screen, trying to minimize that kind of height of the device is a little bit silly. You're already getting into something that's like easily purse or messenger bag territory. I don't think you need to make it, an inch less deep there on the Z-axis there. In terms of the chips that they're doing, it does look like it's a Z2 chip, but the rumor here is that it is actually a Rembrandt chip. So it's the Z2G chip, apparently. AMD is throwing a bit of a wrench here with their naming, so it sounds like the Z2G is Rembrandt, then the Z2 is the old Phoenix chip, basically, and then the Z2 Extreme is the actual new Strix Point chip. So they're basically branding functionally 3 generations of products with Zen 3, Zen 4, and Zen 5 CPU architectures there, and different versions of RDNA there, into products that are labeled within the same family. But I actually think that, if this is just a Rembrandt chip, I'd have to assume probably that there will be variants of this or another similar device with more powerful chips. But even if it is Rembrandt is still like 8 Zen 3 cores and 12 RDNA 2 CUs. So that's a pretty powerful device. It certainly has more hardware on board than the Steam Deck, which is obviously quite capable in its own sense. Would it be as power efficient as the Steam Deck? I'm not so sure, especially under Windows, but that's pretty cool. And at least for me, I kind of look at this device and I'm like, this would be a really cool, possibly Wii U gamepad style device to pair with Bazzite and Moonlight, as I'm so off to look at here. Especially if it can do 120 hertz in the display. Even 90 hertz would be great, but 120 hertz would be fantastic. If they can do a version of this with a Z2 Extreme, that would be even better, obviously. But it looks pretty cool to me, and I like the way that it probably will fit in the hand. That's really what I'm most excited about. And here, one other thing I'm interested in, and this is such a minor detail that perhaps I'm more obsessive than the average person on this, but I am a little bit interested in this, is that on the right-hand side of that device, it looks like they have some kind of touchpad nub or something going on there, maybe like a track point, something weird there. And
right, okay.
That could be a good compromise here, because I think a full trackpad is kind of excessive for a lot of games you want to play on this device. Probably not many games that you want to play on a PC handheld need cursor support. But at the same time, having some kind of hardware functionality support is very important for desktop OSs and extremely important for Windows when you're navigating around. It's very awkward to use the thumbsticks as a cursor in my experience there. You can also have some utility when it comes to navigating game launchers and menus and things like that. So that could be a good middle ground. And also, as far as I recall, the Lenovo Legion Go, the original one, it did have a right-hand trackpad, but it did not have haptic feedback or a clickable trackpad. So on the Steam Deck, you get that beautiful haptic feedback. It's actually really easy to use in games that do demand some degree of precision, like an RTS game, like an MMO game. Those games that you wouldn't normally play on a controller, they actually do give you that feedback that's so critical. And here, if you're not going to give me that feedback with a full-size trackpad, I kind of think you might as well just give me like a little nub or something to, tweak with in Windows when I need to use it, because it's not going to be that useful for any kind of real-time gameplay feedback unless you really put that level of engineering effort into it. So I think this is a really cool device, potentially. If it is a 1080p, 8-inch screen, 120 hertz, with a Rembrandt chip and pretty decent battery life, I think that might be a really compelling device for a lot of people, especially if it comes in at a good price point. And personally, for me, I probably spend a little bit too much time and too much money on these kinds of devices, and I have over the past few years. But perhaps I might even be interested in picking this up if it is a really comfortable device for something like Moonlight on Bazzite. It could be a really good device.
Tom, what do you make of all this?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, it's having it all comes down to the price point it ends up at, but having a more budget orientated SKU would make a lot of sense. I mean, we're looking at what's the ROG Ally and Legion Pro are sort of under $500 at this point, right? It's kind of like around
they're kind of on sale because they're outgoing products essentially.
Yeah, so there'll be a refresh there, and having a kind of a lower tier SKU sets up kind of, and looking at what is in the leak, what's missing essentially are things that are kind of omissible, if that's a word. That there's no kickstand or detachable controllers, but we keep the essentials in the screen size, which is, I think, crucial to what the experience is for what this is. So yeah, I kind of think it's worth releasing as it is, but it's also there's a lot in there which just keeps to what it makes it work best. And I think I'm very curious to see what the battery life will be on it, and the price, of course.
Yeah, the price I think is going to be crucial on this one, because it's kind of got to be Steam Deck money, to be honest. Yeah. Because let's be honest here, it is an older chip seemingly. Z2G really does look like the old 6800U, Oliver, from where I'm standing. Yeah. Which is like, I was reviewing that a couple of years ago. So it's got to be cheap. It's really got to be cheap. If it is a sort of rebadged 6800U, presumably it'd be on an older process, so it would not be particularly power efficient. So it would need a decent battery in there as well. So I don't really know. I think it's got to be cheap. It's got to be challenging the Steam Deck on performance terms. I'd love for there to be a SteamOS variant, going back to what we were talking about earlier. But yeah, an entry-level Windows handheld would be really good. I guess the only issue of that is I've seen some mega deals for the Asus ROG Ally, which is an excellent handheld. Yeah. And the discounts that are happening on the Legion Go, the existing one. I mean, I'm not a massive fan of the Legion Go because it is frankly gigantic, but it's going to be more performant than this, if that's the case, if it is indeed using Z2G. So yeah, I mean, pricing is going to be crucial. I think the whole Z2 lineup, if these rumors are actually true, and it does seem to be like a growing sort of critical mass of leaks that are suggesting that they are. I mean, back for the Z1, there was the basic Z1 that was basically only in the
base model Ally
down version.
Yeah.
And then, but it was only really the Z1 Extreme that people were interested in. Now we've got 3 different versions of Z2 seemingly, and it is essentially like a redux of the last 2 generations, and then a Strix Point version for the Extreme. So maybe AMD is going to be offering some mega deals to the OEMs for those chips based on older technology. I've looked at Strix Point. The content probably isn't up by now. It's up on early access to supporters of the DF supporter program. But Strix Point, it is by far and away the best mobile AMD processor out there. But it's not a million times better than the Z1 Extreme. It's pretty good. You can get some really nice results out of it. So again, it kind of emphasizes to me why Microsoft, Sony, and indeed Valve are kind of holding fire on their own handhelds, or in the case of Valve, their next generation successor, because and it's kind of summed up by this roadmap of Z2 products. It's kind of like gen on gen sort of iterations each time, and we're at the point now with Strix Point where, compared to the Steam Deck, it's got twice as many compute units. The clock speed is almost twice as fast, and yet you're not getting twice the performance. So, what's the issue there? Is it simply just memory bandwidth? They're still using 128-bit interfaces on all of this stuff. I think we have to go to Strix Halo, which is the gigantor class APU that they're planning, to actually get a 256-bit interface. So I'm very curious about take-up of Z2. Z2G, if it is for like $300, $400 handhelds, that would be pretty awesome.
Yeah, on the one hand, I'm not too happy about mixing different chips and different architecture families, especially within one product line. That's something that I really don't like with GPUs. Certainly with CPUs, it's certainly a weird fit here with the Z2 line, but I do think the fact that they should all be pretty decent chips there with respect to performance, they should all at least be giving you a Steam Deck-like experience, I'd assume, at least at decent wattages, if not substantially better there for the higher-end chips. that indicates some level of maturity there where you'd be comfortable going in on even a Z2G device, presuming the price was right, and you'd get a reasonable experience of a lot of software, especially software from like last generation titles. You get a pretty good experience playing those games.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth pointing out that even the 6800M, which is the GPU that looks likely to go into this new Lenovo device, it's still an appreciable bump up from Steam Deck. It's just not as good as the others. Okay, we'll obviously be tracking that. I suspect there's going to be a lot more of this stuff arising from CES. So yeah, look forward to seeing what the products actually look like. But with that, let's move on. Okay, so the deluge of PlayStation 5 Pro software updates continues unabated. We're not going to be covering all of them, but ones that catch our attention, we're certainly going to be looking at, maybe in DF Direct, maybe for standalone videos. But Oliver, this week you've looked at Warhammer 40,000 Darktide on PlayStation 5 Pro. Now, I was really interested to see your results here because on PC this is like a mega demanding game, stripped back quite significantly for the console. So what have we got on the Pro?
Well, so as a bit of background, I covered this game last year on the Xbox. Now It's on the PS5 and PS5 Pro. So the big thing first off out of the gate is you don't get any ray tracing features on PS5 or PS5 Pro. That's critical. So you don't get the Pro-based RTGI, you don't get the reflections, you don't get anything like that on the PlayStation 5, unfortunately. But critically, one thing that has been addressed is the anti-aliasing issue that I noted last year with the Xbox versions, where the aliasing treatment wasn't really there when the game was at rest. That has been resolved here, and the anti-aliasing is functional now. On PS5, it looks like it's about 936p internal, roughly speaking. That's what I got out of a few shots. And it looks like it's taking that to roughly 1440p with some kind of TAAU or possibly FSR2 there. I didn't test it against the PC version, but it did seem to have some upsampling component to me there. And that version, it looks pretty decent now in that performance mode on PS5 because the anti-aliasing is actually resolving correctly, and it's giving you a smooth image at rest and in motion, which wasn't the case last year on the Xboxes. On PS5 Pro, it's running at 1270p internally, according to the developers, and that also aligns closely with my own pixel counts, and it's going to 4K, it looks like, with PSSR. Now, if we do some side-by-sides with that PS5 version in performance mode, though, there's clearly some funny stuff going on in stills. Forgive me if you've heard this before. This is typical PSSR stuff to some degree, but the PSSR image, it looks higher resolution in some sense, like it is resolving into a 4K grid there. It is resolving 1-to-1 into a 4K grid there, and it is giving you more detail on some fine lines, but it's not really sharper on the whole, I would say, even though it is going to higher resolution. It's actually a bit softer often. And that's in part because of this omnipresent shimmer and noise pattern that you see in the PSSR resolve. That's something we see in a lot of games. It actually tends to be at its worst in very dark content. And lo and behold, Warhammer 40k Darktide is full of dark levels and dark areas. Not too much light there. It's the name, exactly. PSSR is never quite cohering into that stable, good-looking, anti-aliased image that we want to see out of an upscaler at rest there. There are some things it does better, for sure, like the text here looks quite a bit better. But overall, in stills, I'd kind of prefer the image rendition that we see on the base console there, with whatever their upsampling solution may be there. Obviously not PSSR on the base PS5. In motion, I'd say it leans more towards PSSR, though, with the PS5 Pro, because it perhaps has similar aliasing, but it is sharper than their old upscaling solution. That's something you see pretty often with PSSR. Yeah. Where it does tend to resolve more sharply in motion, whether that comes down to treating history a bit differently, maybe not reusing as much data there or whatever. It tends to be quite a bit sharper in motion. But the aliasing presentation is not amazing. They struggle with different kinds of content, like the old anti-aliasing solution really struggles with the holographic display here, for instance, whereas PSSR can't quite get the floor greebles to look right here. It looks kind of shimmery and ugly there. If we flip over to quality mode here, really quickly, PSSR looks quite a bit worse. The quality mode is going from roughly 1440p internal to 4K there, and it looks a lot sharper and cleaner, especially in still shots. It's not too close at all there. It just looks like a pretty stable and sharp and good-looking 4K image. PSSR is not really giving you that in this title, I would say. Performance-wise, it's not too amazing, but it's not too bad either. It's basically a slightly wobbly 60 FPS. The worst I saw was about 40 FPS there. It's usually running at 60 FPS or a little bit short of it in more busy scenes and more heavy melees in particular. That's when I saw the frame rate start to tumble down into like the 50 FPS region at times. It's basically similar enough to Xbox last year, maybe a little bit worse. I tested PS5 in performance mode, and I did see some frame rate drops there. They didn't seem quite as impactful though. But it's tough because this is an online game and there are so many factors outside of player control, and I didn't have hours and hours to test exhaustively, so all I'll say is that there are some frame rate drops here. So overall, it's not the worst PS5 Pro patch I've seen. I'm glad they've cleaned up their TAA in particular on that base console machine. It looks a lot better than the Xbox versions did at the point that I tested them last year. But PS5 Pro isn't necessarily the kind of upgrade that we'd want to see over PS5 here. I'm not necessarily sure which platform I would prefer in terms of that 60 FPS visual experience, the PS5 Pro in its sole visual mode, or the PS5 in its performance mode. Ultimately, I do suspect quite strongly that it would have been a better option if they'd gone with their old AA solution, their old upsampling solution, deployed the additional GPU power of the PS5 Pro towards a higher internal resolution and possibly maybe a higher output resolution, who knows? Because the fact that we're getting pretty comparable results with an image that is pushing a lot more pixels on the PS5 Pro does suggest to me that perhaps that old solution worked a little bit better for this game and its content there. So yeah, not super happy with it, but it's not a really bad patch necessarily, but it's also not the kind of upgrade that I think people are probably expecting for a title like this.
Tom, where do you stand on the whole PlayStation 5 Pro thing at the moment? Because I'll tell you where I am. I think that there's been some reaction to some of the more poorly implemented or poor results we're seeing from PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, PSSR. And, there's basically been calls to have an option on the dashboard of the Pro that basically says, don't use the Pro code, use the base PS5 code and allow Game Boost to take over. I think my take on this is that you can't really do that. I think it would be a short-term solution, and it's not a good look for Sony. But I do think that there is certainly a good argument for maybe having options within game to turn on or off PSSR. Where do you sit on it?
I think that's the only way forward, really, in the short term at least, as they, sort of file off the rough edges on the whole PSSR situation, which is clearly, a situation for that is a bit awkward, to be honest, because the first wave of games that have come out for PS5 Pro, we've had a couple of articles and videos in a row where it's been like PSSR is in the headline. And we don't really want it to be, but it's impossible to ignore that as a downside in some cases, notably third-party titles and notably Unreal Engine 5 games with Lumen, for example, seem to be suffering as well. Call of Duty, as we've mentioned. So it's kind of I think for a £700 console, imagine the disappointment, when you get this thing in and you're pretty much forced. And in a lot of cases, I imagine people will be selling their base PS5 to fund that move. And then there's no way back and they're stuck with, a less appealing image. Yeah, having that option to go back within the game code, to just see how it would be played on the base PS5 using that rendering setup would be a huge benefit. I wish we had that in Silent Hill 2. Remake. We tried the disc-based version, didn't we, with that to access that original PS5 code, but then that's another £100 cost you've got to find to get the disc drive. So,
yeah, that's a bit extreme. I think, ultimately the developers need to curate a good experience for PlayStation 5 Pro, but it's just been interesting to me to see that Sony developers have actually included toggles for PSSR on off. Sure. Which kind of is indicative, I think. And I think it's a practice that can go elsewhere as well. Why not have third-party developers do it? It's clearly not a cure-all, I think, is the bottom line there. Well, obviously there is discussions about how the PSSR situation can be improved, Oliver. There's people are calling for like the DLL swap out on PC, where you could actually add in a better version of DLSS by swapping the DLL. You can't do that on consoles, but there have been suggestions that Sony might actually swap in more improved versions of PSSR at the system level. My take on that is, I don't know. I think there needs to be a way for developers to more easily integrate those better versions of PSSR, but to actually take that out of the developer's hands could have unwanted side effects for certain games. I mean, what is the way forward on this? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of PSSR games that are just great. It's some really good implementations out there. But then, we're seeing, I'd say this is kind of a more average implementation. It's not great, but, it is what it is. And then there's the outright shockers like Jedi Survivor and the original version of Silent Hill. What do you think is the way that this is to be addressed? Should Sony step in?
Oh boy, that's a big question.
It's a big question.
It's a big question. I think one thing that does work for me personally is offering the old modes as a safety valve. Sort of. Right. I mean, safety valve, maybe that's being pushing it a little bit too far, but you see this a little bit in The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2, where you get the old modes and you get to run them with the greater GPU resources, and you get to enjoy them at higher frame rates with VRR unlocking them. And in that case, they kind of balance the fact that they're giving you these old modes with the fact that they want you to use the new Pro mode, which is generally a good mode and a superior option in most instances, I would say, relative to those old modes. They balance that reality by basically prompting you every time you boot the game without the Pro mode enabled, saying, hey, we prepared this special mode for you, wouldn't you like to try it? And I think that's a good way to go about it, in my opinion. I think the route of providing players a lot of different modes with a lot of different configurations of PSSR, a lot of different ways to play, that is maybe not my preferred way to go. I kind of like the route with the old modes, because at least then you're giving players a kind of base from which to work from, and you are at least saying, if we do happen to mess up these new modes, we're giving you an option to play with the old modes. And those are kind of known good quantities for a lot of titles, right? For older titles, those are known good quantities there. But ultimately, I mean, my preferred solution here would be that games are just set up quite well for PSSR, and that we leave everything up to developer discretion. That'd be kind of my preferred model. But at the moment, I'm not quite sure why. I do think a lot of these issues are probably being caught by QA. It's fairly trivial to pull up the two consoles, the two dev kits on two different monitors and compare them. So I have to imagine a lot of these problems are being caught. I kind of wonder if maybe there's some political element to this, where it's like, well, we want to integrate the new feature from Sony on our new PlayStation 5 Pro version, and that will be a good way to get eyeballs on our game, and that will be a good way to achieve our goals with this title, even if it doesn't necessarily achieve the best visual result. Again, I'm only speculating here because it is unusual that we've seen so many games come through with lackluster, or even in a couple of rare cases, worse than PS5 PSSR implementations. That's certainly quite concerning. I don't really have a good solution for it. Maybe a system level toggle, maybe that would do some good, but I mean, ultimately, my preference is always with consoles to leave it up to developer discretion pretty much, and hope that they would exercise that discretion in a way that is favorable to the ultimate end experience, because I trust them to ship the game in a form that's going to flatter it. And that hasn't been the case so far, but I have to imagine, as knowledge kind of permeates through the industry about this technology and its potential pitfalls, and also its potential room for improvement in future PSSR iterations, that developers will be implementing PSSR in their titles in a way that more fully supports their artistic vision in terms of achieving really good image quality at high frame rates and all these things that we'd like to see at a PS5 Pro. I kind of hope and kind of think that they'll get there eventually.
Yeah, I think that from my perspective, one of the issues is maybe that games are getting more complex. Launch issues seem to be getting worse. And that was even before the arrival of PlayStation 5 Pro, which means now developers have another SKU they need to address, and maybe something's got to give there. So maybe that is part of the reason why some of these games are launching in a suboptimal state on the PlayStation 5 Pro. Not sure how that would explain games like Jedi Survivor, where, you know, it's basically been out for a very long time and is basically a grafted on add-on as such. But I think the pressures on developers more generally have never been greater, and that's possibly one of the reasons why this is happening. And I think another reason, of course, is the fact that there isn't been a great there isn't as much of a differentiating factor for this Pro console than there is for the last one. The last one was basically, we're going to take your existing games and make them look good on a 4K display. This one is, okay, we're going to make performance mode look better, which is admirable, but you've actually got to deliver on that, and that's not happening on some games. You know, for every Rebirth, you know, there seems to be a Darktide, you know, basically. That's the way it is. And then sometimes we have the Jedi Survivors, which isn't great. But, you know, I guess right now it is what it is, and it will get better. I just think maybe, you know, there's some people out there who've bought the $700 console and are now wondering why. If you know, you've got to have that uniform increase in quality across all software, just as you would with, you know, let's say I've got a 4060 and I'm going to buy a 4070, you know, my games will run faster. You know, I'll be able to use more features. That's kind of what should be happening with the Pro. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so last week saw the release of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle on Xbox Series X, S, and of course the PC. And the PC version has actually caused a good deal of controversy pre-launch, based on the fact that it requires GPUs that have hardware accelerated ray tracing support. So the base spec there actually is a RTX 2060 Super, which brings in VRAM into the discussion, basically, which we'll discuss shortly. Where should we begin on this? Let's begin with this supporter question from Spoggy99. DDF, with Indiana Jones and the Great Circle launching tomorrow, I noticed it's the first big release to my knowledge requiring a GPU capable of hardware-accelerated ray tracing. There was Metro Exodus, of course. What are your thoughts on this design choice? Do you think this approach could help future-proof the game visually, or might it alienate players? Additionally, how do you see this impacting performance scaling across PC and consoles? Thanks for your insights, and I hope you're all staying warm and enjoying the build-up to the holidays. It's always a pleasure to hear your thoughts. So a relatively positive response there from Spoggy99, Alex, but a lot of people are sort of like not happy that 10 series GPUs are not able to run Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. But ultimately, I mean, those are like, you know, 8-year-old GPUs at this point. I think it's okay that it's time to move on, and there does seem to have been concern about performance, which we'll talk about shortly. But you know, it's okay to have a game that demands hardware RT at this point, surely.
Yeah, right. And just a little bit of perspective, and I wrote this elsewhere just a few days back, is that when DirectX 9.0C came out, Shader Model 3, that was 2004. And the first games to require it were shortly after the Xbox 360's release. Just 2.5 years later was some of the first games that required Shader Model 3. For example, like all the UE3 games did. And that was you getting the top end, maybe 6800 Ultra in 2004 and couldn't play games on it just 2.5 years later. Now, the Turing series of GPUs came out in 2018. And you can still play this game on them, and that's 6 years later.
Right.
Pascal, 8 years, you know, really just give up at this point. You really should be upgrading your GPU if you want to play the latest and greatest. And if you don't, there's tons of games you can still play on that old Pascal hardware. Regarding the...
Nice Don Matrick there, Alex.
Yeah. Thanks. I'm Don Matrick for ray tracing. I don't know. That doesn't also sound good. But regarding like what it means for the scaling of the game in the future, I think it's great for id Tech in general. Id Tech having a mandatory ray tracing base allows them specifically in this game, as John already talked about in his video, and my video should be out by the time this is out there, should be out on the weekend, I imagine, is that ray trace GI is forming the foundation of this game's lighting. And having that as your base is a huge part to streamlining the development process. If you made it toggleable, which they arguably could have done, they would have had to have created 2 versions of the lighting for the game. They would have maybe also have not been able to do a lot of scenes where they rapidly transition cameras without tons of data streaming, and or changing the lighting in rooms might have not even worked. A lot of things that they do in the game. So it's an altogether great thing. And based upon what I saw for scalability, it runs on a Series S at 60 FPS with a version of the RTGI. There's scalability in there in terms of like visual quality, but it's running there. So I think they made all the right choices, and I only see this as positive. And I'm only a little sad it didn't happen earlier. That's about it. But games take a really long time to develop these days.
And of course, GPUs are getting more expensive, and I think that's a fair point. But ultimately, yes, it is the case now that Turing hardware has been around for 6 years. It's only really the RTX 2060 which is not great, and that's for entirely different reasons, which is the VRAM side of things, which does cause issues for 8GB cards on there. But I think based on your video, you've got an outline of why it is like it is, and it's a similar situation where lowering textures from Ultra isn't a disaster.
Right. It is not a disaster. And it's kind of like previous id Tech games where basically this game is VRAM limited. They probably designed it around a minimum, at least for the PC style quality options here, around like a minimum of 8, but ideally 12. So if you had 10 or 8, you're going to be making compromises based upon your resolution output. And whether or not those are wholly visible always is somewhat user subjective, but you can see it happening if you put them side by side. So it'll lead to, like in a game like this, which uses virtual texturing, it'll lead to more visible swap closer to the camera. And some textures may never load high res because the cache is already too full, essentially. And that's like a typical virtual texturing. I wouldn't call it issue, but by design, it's trying to make it so the game doesn't run poorly. In a case like this, 8GB and 10GB GPUs have to make certain compromises, but specifically for the 10GB GPUs out there, the one that is the big one, the RTX 3080, it's actually not that big of a deal. It's actually still really amazing on that GPU. I'd say 8GB GPUs, it's a little sadder because you have something like an RTX 3070, which is it's a very powerful GPU for its class, but that 8GB is like hamstringing some of the visuals in aspects where if it just had more memory, it would be, an amazing experience,
Well, there was NVIDIA's own benchmarks for the Supreme settings where they basically had the entire stack, and it ended with 4060 Ti, and then the little footnote there, it's the 16GB version of the 4060 Ti, which was third-party only and much lower supply than the 8GB version, which,
What about that, NVIDIA? I call shenanigans.
Who call shenanigans? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, in this case, I just wish NVIDIA had been shipping way better VRAM amounts on these some of these more powerful GPUs.
I think that's my biggest sort of issue with 40 series looking back now. There were some bumps to 70 class, but it was more expensive. Yeah, it wasn't great. And obviously there's now rumors that the 5060 is going to be an 8GB GPU, which I don't think is a very good idea.
Oh no, really?
Yeah, we got Intel coming in with a 12GB card at $250, which, that's kind of what we should be doing at this point.
Yeah, this is where it should be.
Guys. Come on now.
Okay, let's go back to supporter questions. We're going to start off with this one from Bassus. The very best of afternoons to you, gents! ! I like the way people like to write me questions in like Victorian English.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I noticed that, to my knowledge, the Indiana Jones PC release is the first to suggest a 4090 for ultra settings! Given how performant previous machine games have been, is this a surprise to me alone? Double question mark. This one from Evan. I've been pretty much frustrated about the dialogue on Indiana Jones PC requirements. Machine Games has presented a bunch of options describing different configurations. for some people, for some reason, many people only look at the absolutely heaviest requirement and determine that only 1490 owners can enjoy the game. Isn't it a good thing that games are being developed that push the envelope of what current hardware can handle? Doesn't this likely mean that this game will scale well into the future as hardware evolves? So this has been an interesting one, Alex, because a lot of people have been asking about the spec recommendations. The 1490 recommendation, that I'm assuming is for path tracing, right?
It is. So
right, okay. Well, that's a completely different rendering paradigm, basically, to everything else. So, not quite the same, really, is it?
No. Regarding the other thing, so yes, the game putting a 4090 at the top of the list for Ultra is different than in the past, because I think the previous games, such as Alan Wake and I would also put Outlaws on there, Star Wars Outlaws from Massive, as well as Cyberpunk. On their top end category, they pretty much always said RTX 4080 using DLSS 3 frame gen. Pretty sure they always say that. This time they say 4090, and they reference the fact that it might be above 60 FPS only with DLSS 3, but I'm not sure what to say about that yet. I haven't played it yet. I don't know what it is. But the idea that even a game with path tracing, full ray tracing, whatever you may want to call it, could challenge a 4090 to the point where in DLSS performance mode, it's only like 40 FPS or something. I actually think that makes sense. And that's a good thing, because don't forget, there's going to be GPUs after the RTX 4090 in the future. And we always kind of want games to push as far as they can for their highest settings, so that in a couple of years we can enjoy them with better graphics. And now we can just turn down the graphics a little bit, the res a little bit, and get better performance. And that's typically the way it works. And I think that's only ever a good thing. And just as an example, games like Cyberpunk and Alan Wake, they're beautiful on their highest settings, but they can technically go further. Things like Glass and Cyberpunk with the full RT option overdrive is actually still simplistically ray traced. It's not actually doing crazy stuff like refraction and like diffusion of light. And there's no like caustics rendering or anything like that, stuff that real glass would do. And there's ways you can imagine NVIDIA specifically wanting to push rendering forward that would go above what a 4090 can do reasonably at 60 FPS at 4K. That all sounds good to me. But the question or the response by the other user, I also wholly humbly agree. They show on this list the game running at 1080p 60 native on an RTX 2060 Super, a GPU which is less powerful than the PlayStation 5 by a good deal, I would say, in good core metrics. Maybe not always in ray tracing, but still. And then you have, at the very top of 4090, that's like the hugest spectrum that I've seen in a specs list in a while. And it also just delineated whether or not it's using native rendering. It delineated that it was 60 FPS. Like this is actually a pretty good specs list, all things considered. And based upon what I've played with the game so far, the game is really, really performant, minus the VRAM considerations that I think are also reasonable. So it seems like a great game, actually.
Okay, final point here. I actually agree with it. Noah Saffer asks, "Hello, gentlemen!" ! I thought it was very games industry in 2024 that Indiana Jones on PC is not launching in the quote-unquote early access period with the full ray tracing settings. Instead, the game will be patched on the official launch of December the 9th to enable the feature set. For the players paying an extra $30 for the deluxe edition, it feels like a disservice to provide enthusiast features 3 days late. No thanks, I'll wait. This was kind of like one of our sort of disappointments when we first loaded up the PC version. It's like, well, where's the path tracing? It ain't here. They teased us, Alex.
They teased us. And
you weren't happy, were you?
Yeah, there was a rug swipe here or something at one point. I was not happy, but I'm happy. There's a lot of funny things. Yes, it is super games industry 2024. The fact that something is not ready on time, right? Oh my god. But I actually think it has a turnaround positive effect, because all the early users and all the people who play games in an uninformed technical way that are reviewing the game, like seriously, like if they're playing the game on like an RTX 2060, right? John and I have gotten DMs in the past like this. So
we know this.
Someone's like, why is the game running poor?
Laptops.
Yeah, I'm running the game on my 5-year-old laptop. Why is it running poorly? I'm reviewing this game for X outlet.
Dude, remember Cyberpunk? Cyberpunk was a buggy game, yes, but like there were people running that thing on it's like
you should
potatoes.
not be playing, yeah.
And they're like, dude, what are you even doing here?
Yeah,
don't
exactly.
review it on that.
And this is the thing that I'm happy because the early word of mouth is from the game running settings that still look really good, generally minus the shadow maps, which John talked about in his review. And as a result, that's the word of mouth that spreads around. The game runs really well, even at max settings, even though that whole max settings thing is completely arbitrary, right? That good word of mouth prevents the stupidity that happens on launch day when a game does include forward-looking settings. Everyone runs it at max and says, why is my RTX 4060 running path tracing at 4K? And like
Angry Alex is best Alex.
Yeah, well, I've just been scarred by whatever happened after Crisis, I guess. So I've been scarred since 2007 at that point. So I'm actually kind of, in a roundabout way, happy it doesn't launch with the full graphics on day one. Weirdly,
you think they took a page from Crisis Warhead for the graphics settings names?
Yes.
Stuff like Supreme and everything.
Yeah.
Like it's not actually this, but it feels like the lowest settings in this game it'd be like ultra high is the lowest you can go.
Yeah, I still love that. And they were realistically named in Crisis Warhead. I think they're like, well, not realistic. They're still stupid, but it's like Gamer is the one that is like high now. But it was Crisis 2 where they named even the low setting high, which I love.
Highest, the lowest you could do was high.
Yeah.
You couldn't run it on medium or low settings. It just wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
It just did not exist. Which, by the way, still looked pretty good.
That should have existed for Indiana Jones. That's one complaint I have. As we discovered, the Series S version especially scales way below the PC version, right?
Oh, it does, way below.
Why aren't those settings available on PC? Because like this would allow it to run on like much smaller systems. Like, yes, you still have the RT requirement, but like for like handheld PCs and the like, this is like a perfect thing. Those Series S settings.
Yes.
I always complain about that in games when games don't have the console settings. Not equivalent. They always don't need that like original console settings, but they need at least the ability to degrade the game as much as it's degraded on console. And a lot of games actually don't do that always.
Okay. End result of this, Alex, is that you're probably going to be doing a second video on Indiana Jones concentrating on the path tracing.
Yeah, this upcoming week when it launches on December 9th. The path tracing, that is. Yeah.
While we're still talking PC on this game, though, I did want to throw out one note that I discovered myself on testing it. HDR doesn't seem to work with DLSS. Unfortunately, which is a weird oversight. Essentially, if you enable them at the same time, you end up with this like it looks like pink green noise in all the highlights. It looks broken. There's like color banding and pink greeny noise in it. It doesn't look right. Disabling HDR fixes it, or disabling DLSS fixes it. In my case, I actually found the better solution was to disable the in-game HDR and either use Auto HDR or NVIDIA's HDR to inject HDR into it while still using DLSS. And I think it looks similarly good, maybe a little better in some ways as the native HDR. So like, I'd rather have, because obviously on a higher end PC, you can play at, 4K native with DLAA on top of it and still hit 120 FPS with room to spare. The image quality is insane like that at like whatever supreme settings or whatever they call it. That's no problem on there. So it really, I hope they can fix that. Knowing how HDR is often not that well tested in game development studios, just due to the nature of it, I assume it's just a small oversight that they missed and hopefully will fix very, very soon.
Yeah. So. Definitely not the first time I've seen that, by the way. I think the first time I saw it was Metro Exodus Enhanced Editions. The HDR was broken with DLSS originally.
That's right. I remember that. Well, before we wrap up, though, it is also worth mentioning just how freaking good this game is. And so I think everyone expected Machine Games to deliver a good game, but this turned out significantly better than good. I'd say it's the best thing they've ever made. And arguably one of the absolute best licensed games in the history of the medium. in that they truly fully understand the character and the franchise, and they've successfully managed to develop gameplay systems that embody like the entirety of Indiana Jones. It's not something you see often. I mean, like I would say the Spider-Man and Batman games on the superhero front actually did it pretty damn well, but Indiana Jones is like, it's never been done at this level. There's been good Indiana Jones games, but never like this that fully embodies everything, and they really did it. It is effectively like this, like, I mean, I called it a spiritual successor to Riddick, and I think that's true. It follows that sort of design, but at a much larger scale and just with more of everything.
Way bigger.
And it's still that same concept of taking essentially like a movie series and turning it into a surprisingly well-made game. And there's even a Riddick Easter egg in there, which is fun, in the Vatican area. So, but yeah, I mean, and just beyond that, just this is, to me, like, obviously it's a Bethesda thing developed by Machine Games, and Microsoft owns them. This is the best thing to come out of Xbox in terms of like an Xbox published first party release in like the last 5 years, I would say. This is the kind of game they've sorely been missing. They just don't put out stuff like this much anymore, and they needed this one, and it is extremely good. Mm-hmm. This is the best, arguably one of the absolute best things you could play on an Xbox console right now, essentially. Excellent. Is what I'm saying. So
I'd agree with that.
I'm really happy that they got this done, and it came in right before the holidays even, but it is absolutely worth playing, I think, if you're into single player kind of games like this, of course. Plus, you know, like I said, it's our first look at next generation id Tech, and the fact that they managed to get, I mean, an 1800p average game on Xbox Series X running at 60 FPS with no options for quality mode. It's just straight, like, there's one mode, it's only 60 and it's locked 60 with ray trace diffuse global illumination. That's extremely stable, by the way, with like very little noise. It's honestly almost miraculous, and it's the kind of thing that you just rarely see. And it's like, yeah, id Tech, or Motor as their specific iteration of id Tech is called. It's just kicking butt again. Awesome. So congrats to them on that. And yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, well, we've got Indiana Jones stuff on the channel, more to come, obviously. But with that, we're going to switch back to our original panel here. So thanks, John and Alex, for joining me for that. Cheers. Now let's move on to Supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week I ask our supporters on the DF Supporter Program to put forth a bunch of questions to us to consider. We pick the ones that are best, or other ones we're best equipped to answer. And we're going to kick off with this one from Darjar Co. And it is kind of pro-related. Happy half fortnight, lads. With the new Indiana Jones game marking a milestone on PC by mandating hardware ray-tracing support, is the industry likely reaching a tipping point on a hardware RT? And could this be a very good thing for the PS5 Pro in the next couple of years, since it's currently the only console hardware that can hold and quote-unquote RT candle to PC? Well, until Switch 2 melts our console pleb eyes next summer. That's an interesting question, you know, continuing the PS5 Pro discussion. Indiana Jones, as a game, uses RTGI, and on the PC, there is no option to disable it. It's there even on the low setting. I think based on the video that Alex has put out, Xbox is using kind of lower than low RTGI settings in order to get a good resolution and just to make Series S possible at all. I don't know what you think about this, Tom, but you know, I think if the technology is there, the ray tracing technology within the PC version that does scale to higher levels of fidelity. Obviously, we've got Indiana Jones coming to PlayStation 5 Pro in a few months. So surely it makes sense that similar to like Fortnite, we're going to be seeing enhanced RT features on the Pro.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big promises of the console, and this is one where it'll definitely deliver. Less of maybe how it scales across the settings on PC will determine how much of an impact it has for pro users. I mean, the fact it is a core part of the visual design, the GI, is absolutely gorgeous in that game. Like I got to play it properly in a preview build, and Alex is obviously, and John are obviously on the review for this one. but it is obvious right away that every area is built with a GI sort of not baked in, but it's like part of the visual design that it's got to be ray traced. How PS5 Pro will go, above and beyond what we're seeing on the Xbox consoles is, the Series X kind of remains to be seen, but I'd love to see just, the high quality version of, at least on PC's high preset. I think that'd be a nice get. I don't think we're going to see path tracing in any capacity, because that is something that's been promised, but we're not. I don't think it's available right now on PC. So, and yeah, even in the preview build, it was just not available to actually try out. They were pretty adamant at the event that we could not use it. So, I'm very curious if any element of the path tracing could migrate its way to PS5 Pro in some capacity. That's where.
If you've seen Alex's comparisons of the low setting with Xbox Series X, I think if we just got the Pro running at the low setting on PC, it would be pretty great because it's a lot more feature complete, I'd say, in terms of RT. Yeah. But anything higher than low, obviously gravy. But low, looks pretty great. Oliver, thoughts on this? I mean, obviously, it kind of makes sense that the longer the Pro is about, the better it will be utilized, and perhaps more of the PC features will be tapped into.
Yeah, I mean, I think with PS5 Pro, we kind of have to wait and see a little bit in terms of what emerges with ray tracing on the hardware, because we've seen early titles like F124, like GT7 using ray tracing in a really compelling way on the hardware, but we need to see, I think, more titles. We need to get a bit more of a baseline of what the Pro can do. We still don't have a full disclosure of what the architecture even is in the PlayStation 5 Pro that is enabling it to achieve higher ray tracing performance than the PS5 beyond just the improvement to compute units there. Certainly with the PS5 Pro, I mean, it would be incredible if it had full RT. I wouldn't expect that. If it had RT shadows, though, I think that would be cool. Maybe that's more achievable, because we know the game does have some big issues with shadow maps and presenting stable and coherent looking shadows across a wide range of gameplay spaces. From what I've seen from John, it does not do a great job of that. So perhaps RT shadows could help them quite a bit, especially with multiple light sources there in interior spaces. I'm sure it would be quite nice looking. I do just hope that they drop VRS for PS5 and PS5 Pro, because some of the shots that John has shared with me, the VRS is not really treating the consoles very nicely, especially on Series S, but even on Series X, it is an issue. It does remind me of some other titles that we've seen with various VRS implementations, perhaps not quite as bad as Dead Space in terms of that kind of blockiness and that artifacting, but you are getting considerably reduced texture detail. That's the thing that stands out in surface detail. Does not look quite as it should, I would say. And then VRS plus the possibility of PSSR, that is less exciting to me even still. So hopefully they figure out a way to achieve good image quality in PS5 and PS5 Pro there. But yeah, in general, I think being able to rely on ray trace lighting as a baseline is very, very helpful. Hardware ray tracing cards have been on the market for like 6 years now on the NVIDIA side, 4 years now on the AMD side. Ray tracing solves so many problems in computer graphics. Just that baseline functionality certainly in the massive titles that we've seen recently in Star Wars Outlaws and Avatar. That's pretty incredible. Now, of course, in those titles, they have a software-based fallback for their ray tracing on PC for cards that don't support the full hardware RT feature set there. So that is one way to go about things. But certainly, I think if you're mandating hardware RT capability for a title being released towards the tail end of 2024, to me that seems perfectly reasonable. And I think it's just about time we kind of moved on and we started to demand that, games actually push out these features, even if that does exclude the bottom end of the PC market potentially.
Mm-hmm. I think the market, going back to the original question, the industry probably is reaching a tipping point. Indiana Jones is quite interesting in that, RTGI will basically solve a lot of problems for developers during the development process. It will streamline a lot of the lighting, certainly. In terms of the Pro, I do expect there'll be a ray tracing upgrade on there. It just kind of makes sense if they've had to essentially produce the console versions on lower than low settings. I just wish that lower than low setting was actually available on the PC version. Just kind of makes sense to me. The VRS situation is actually quite interesting there, Oliver. I hadn't really thought of that. Obviously, the base PlayStation 5 does not support hardware VRS, which I believe is being used on Xbox. So it won't have that issue, but it might have a lower resolution or something like that. However, the Pro, I believe it does support hardware VRS. So will they not use it because it's not used on the base? Or will they use it and we're not particularly happy that they are using it? That's going to be an interesting one, isn't it?
That's interesting, actually. id Tech, I remember Doom Eternal did have VRS on Xbox platforms, but did not have VRS on the PlayStation 5 version. So perhaps, I mean, there are other ways to implement VRS, but hopefully that would be, I would hope it's excluded in general from the PlayStation 5 versions of the game. Certainly from the base PlayStation 5 version, there might be some level of hardware incompatibility, obviously, with hardware VRS that would preclude them from doing that. I think maybe the better route would be to use something like TAAU, maybe something like FSR, lower internal resolution, higher output resolution, no VRS, in my opinion. Maybe that's a better way to go. Maybe they'll embrace something similar in PS5 Pro, who knows? Maybe at that point they'll have moved on to another solution on Xbox consoles, because I think the results there, especially on the Series S, are not perfect, but we'll just have to see there. But yeah, hopefully they can achieve something compelling for PS5 Pro users.
Let's move on to the next question. This one comes from Dresden Files 00. I'm sure there's a reference there that I've completely missed, but let's move on. Hi, DF team. This is less a question and more of a statement for additional discussion regarding the future, the idea of a future Xbox becoming more PC-like. I have to say, I really dislike this idea. Multiple storefronts would be welcome. However, I do not want the inherent Windows issues to be present on a console, traditional or handheld. Ever since updating to Windows 11 24H2, I've had a number of issues with games crashing. Then there are cases like Jedi Survivor, which I played at launch on Xbox due to PC issues, even though I really wanted to play it at higher quality on PC. I've been console gaming since the 80s and PC gaming since the early 90s. Both have their place, but I want a console experience to be frustration-free and as consistent as possible. Thoughts? Well, my immediate thought is that I agree entirely. And that's the core challenge facing any kind of merging / transition / integration between Xbox and Windows, is that you can't diminish the Xbox experience just by introducing PC compatibility. And this is a really tight sort of a tightrope that Microsoft is going to have to tread very carefully across, because absolutely there could be problems there. And I think, if they want to do this properly, they've got to, we've discussed this several times on the Direct before, there's a whole series of foundational issues that need to be addressed. Interface, I think they can do that. I mean, they've got a pretty decent interface on Xbox consoles. The whole DirectX situation, that needs addressing. There's a lot going on there, that's for sure. And I'm just kind of interested as to how this is going to resolve, because, in theory, we shouldn't be having situations like Jedi Survivor where the Xbox console version is all right, but the PC version is basically a disaster, when fundamentally, it's very, very similar hardware at the core foundational level. So how this is actually happening, I don't know, but it certainly can't be allowed to transition across to whatever the new console will turn into. But at the same time, I can certainly see why Microsoft is doing this, because obviously the traditional console model hasn't paid off for them. They haven't really gained market share. And in fact, the total addressable market for consoles in general hasn't increased. So something has got to give, and Microsoft is arguably well placed to do it. But the actual implementation of this is hugely significant and potentially terrifying as well. Tom, what do you make of this idea of what Microsoft is doing here, this idea that somehow Windows and Xbox can come together into one glorious whole?
I love the idea of it. I love a unified, store. I love the idea that all my purchases could be translate across to like an Xbox PC. That's all great on paper. The practical reality, though, is that we've seen what happened with the Microsoft Store, and we see what the issues with that, and we've seen the issues that can arise with PC gaming. Even if the ceiling for quality on PC is substantially higher, and you can achieve some incredible experiences that are only possible on PC, like RTS games, for example, and achieve higher settings, it's still involving that first couple of months sometimes that never gets resolved, just dealing with issues and facing with you've got to face driver issues, you've got to face OS changes, you've got to face a lot of variables that just are unforeseen, and even with the best intentions from a developer, you can come a cropper. So I'm cautious for the very same reason as Dresden Files 00 mentions there. It's inherent in the PC space that you're going to have to fight a little bit for the benefits that you get with PC gaming, and that's why I stick with console mostly nowadays. Like I still love PC, but to relax at the end of the day, I want all that stuff to be sorted with a fixed spec machine that developers have already optimized around. I don't think that's unreasonable.
It's an interesting point there, Tom. I mean, fundamentally, a lot of people are time poor and they just want to pick up a game and play it. They don't want to be mucking about with driver updates. They don't want to be having issues with Windows 11 where, for example, now there's a bunch of Ubisoft games that don't work on a certain revision of Windows.
Right. Yeah.
And Windows Update isn't updating if you've got Ubisoft games installed. Yeah. There's crazy stuff happening there. It's almost like Wild West. I don't quite understand what's going on there. Oliver, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Microsoft has to make a very concerted effort to basically bring the Xbox experience over to PC. And they have to prove that you can create a console-like experience that runs on top of desktop Windows, I suppose, there, and all the potential pitfalls that might introduce. I don't know if Microsoft can do it. In some sense, abstractly, I have not much faith in Windows. I have not used Windows as my daily operating system for 14 years now. I've used macOS. That's for a number of reasons. One of them has to do with stability and updates and just difficulty in general operation. And I have new reasons now with the kind of adware and bloatware and bizarre automatic updates and things like that Microsoft now imposes that they didn't impose on older versions of Windows. So if this is a very Xbox-centric thing with an Xbox interface and an Xbox approach to updates that deals with shader compilation and other problems and hassles, that's fantastic. But the moment you show me a Windows 11 desktop interface or a pop-up for Microsoft 365, or like just the other day I booted up my computer and all of a sudden Microsoft Teams was open. I don't ever recall installing Microsoft Teams, but it was just open. It just opened itself, and it's like, okay, well, this is great. It feels like you have not that much control over your actual experience sometimes on Windows these days. So that's not too enticing, I have to say. But I do think on the flip side that if Microsoft does nail it, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that the idea of the comfort and convenience of a console interface married with the almost infinite power, unlimited power of a PC, I think that's very, very exciting potentially. And I'd love to see that. Now, will Microsoft do that? I'm rooting for them to possibly achieve that. I think that Valve is probably going to do that for me at some point in the next year or two, and I'm excited to see that as well. But I'm excited for that concept. I think it's possibly a very interesting concept for someone who wants some of that more streamlined experience, but also wants to have a little bit more hardware power on tap and more customizability as well.
Yeah, I mean, at some point they're going to have to break cover with, it could be years away at this point. They're going to have to break cover with how they're going to do this. I can't wait to see how they do it. Obviously, on Xbox, they've got these virtualized environments within that games run within, which may be a way to kind of isolate games from, just the general shenanigans that happens with Windows. But that's just a thought. I mean, it's certainly a tough nut to crack. Let's move on to the next question. This one comes from Struggling Shader. Hi DF, I'd like to ask about what is the best way to use a low to mid-range GPU with a 4K TV. For instance, in a scenario where I can only get playable frame rates in 4K using DLSS Ultra Performance, which is a 9 times resolution boost, wouldn't it be better to lower the display resolution to a non-native 1440p for the display and use less aggressive temporal upscaling, maybe quality mode for a similar performance? Or similarly, if you're already using DLSS performance or even ultra performance at 1440p non-native in a 4K TV, how about lowering to 1080p quality for less artifacts and smoother performance with a similar base resolution of 720p? Does everyone in the panel share the same preference in these scenarios? And would those preferences change with an AMD GPU with only FSR2 available? So the idea here that Struggling Shader is putting across is actually nothing new, because we see it all the time on consoles. So let's take, for example, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora on the base PlayStation 5 or the Series X. You've got a quality mode that's upscaling to 4K, right? And I think you can say that based on the current sort of PC landscape, Series X and PC and PS5 rather are using kind of low to mid-range GPUs, 4060 class, that sort of thing. So yeah, Avatar, 4K quality mode, upscaling to 4K. Performance mode is upscaling to 1440p, and then there's kind of just a naive, probably Lancho's upscale from there to 4K. So that's kind of what I think Struggling Shader is suggesting here on how to do it. Oliver, I think personally that you probably could be using a mid-range GPU or a low to mid-range GPU like an RTX 4060 on a 4K screen, but it's probably not the best idea. But there's certainly different strategies to be able to make it happen.
I think for DLSS at least, I think it depends on the circumstance, and it depends on the game and the kinds of content that game has. I think 4K ultra performance, if you have the power on tap for it, can be pretty reasonable depending on the game. Perhaps not for something like Cyberpunk, but games with simpler content, I think it can look all right. But some of it depends too. It really does depend on how the game is implementing stuff like post-processing and whatnot, because if you're running the motion blur, for instance, at internal res, you really, like with Final Fantasy 16 on PC, for instance, I found that looked really, really bad with DLSS at ultra performance at 4K, because the post-processing was like 720p. But when I hiked it up to like 1080p internal, regardless of what the output was, it started to look okay with the post-processing there, with the motion blur, which is quite heavy in that title. So it really just depends, I think, quite heavily on the game there. Sometimes doing 1440p with a lower upscale factor, i.e. a higher internal resolution, will give you a cleaner visual result than 4K with a really aggressive upscale factor there. But to this person's question, with FSR2, I would definitely say I gravitate towards lower outputs with higher internal resolutions when put to this kind of question here, because FSR2 or FSR3 ultra performance at 4K looks pretty bad, but FSR2 balanced or quality at 1440p with like a Lanczos upscale to 4K there for your display, I think that can look pretty good, especially if you're sitting like a normal distance from a television like that. I think to me the thing that stands out more than loss in clarity and detail between like a 1440p output and a 4K output with upscaling there would be the presence of heavy shimmering or artifacts from frame to frame there, and getting some of that temporal instability. That's the thing that I really want to protect against, especially when I'm looking at a larger format television from a decent distance. Those are the things that your eye tends to pick up more. So for sure, in those instances, you'd rather go to 1440p with a less aggressive upscale factor, with a more conservative upscale factor there, to give you, I think, the best quality image in the end. I think that's probably the route to go.
Yeah, not exactly your wheelhouse, Tom, but any thoughts?
Well, it is. I think my preference has always been NVIDIA DLSS for just the handling of low resolutions, especially low, like ultra performance mode, 720p to 4K scales. But I think looking at Struggling Shader's question at the start there, he's specifically dialing into using a 4K TV as well. So if you're like using a 4K TV, let's like imagine that you're not swapping in another monitor and you're really like looking to, output at 1440p to a 4K display, and then you've got kind of two forms of upscale going on at the same time, right? So it seems like, I don't know if I'd prefer that over, I think I'd rather personally target the native resolution of the display as much as possible to avoid the double upscale. But if you're resorting to 720p to get there, it's kind of a tough call. I think I've always preferred to have the final output at the matching 1-to-1 for the pixel structure of the final display. But so that's where I'd go with that one.
Yeah, my thoughts on this. I mean, Dragon Age, the Veilguard is quite interesting in that you can actually set the upscaler to upscale to something like 1440p and then still specify a 4K HUD. That's a really nice thing to have. That's the one disadvantage on a PC of actually targeting the non-native output resolution, is that the HUD will be at that non-native output resolution. So Dragon Age has kind of set the stage there. But I don't know. I think that the main issue is addressing the native resolution for the output on DLSS is that there's still quite a lot of internal processing that's going to be happening at native res, like native res post-process buffers and stuff like that.
That's true.
I think ultimately you're just going to have to adjust to taste, and it probably will change on a title by title basis. What I have found, and I'm not sure it's a great fit for a low to mid-range GPU, but targeting 1800p from something like a 4070, you save a lot of performance on that, and the reduction in resolution on the HUD isn't really that onerous. So that's something else on a different tier of card. But low to mid range, we're talking PS5 level performance. Really, it can be done, but it's not ideal. Anyway, let's move on. Interesting question here from Edna Mode. Do you think third-party Switch 2 games will consistently output at 900p or 720p after DLSS to reduce strains on bandwidth, battery life, etc. in handheld mode? It's not always clear the relationship between DLSS performance boosts and parts of the pipeline it does not benefit. I guess it's kind of another sort of variation of the previous question there, Oliver. But I think it's fair to say that we're going to be seeing quite a lot of DLSS in Switch 2, simply by virtue of the fact it's a mobile chipset.
Yeah, I mean, to this person's question, I think we will be seeing a lot of DLSS, but I also think we'll be seeing a lot of DLSS that does not go to the native 1080p panel resolution of that handheld screen, and probably especially not the native 4K resolution that this thing will be targeting when connected to 4K televisions. At least that it will be upscaling to. I don't think we'll be seeing a lot of that either. But I'd have to assume that for a lot of titles, 720p or 900p as a DLSS target there would make sense for a lot of games. DLSS gets a lot more expensive when you start to target higher output resolutions there. The cost really does depend on that output resolution in terms of the amount of milliseconds that it's going to take to run on that GPU there. But I'd kind of assume that this would depend a lot on the project as well. Like for games that are predominantly developed on 8th gen consoles, like your typical PS4 port, perhaps 900p output or 1080p output in handheld play could be reasonable. And then something like you'd imagine maybe 1440p output in docked mode could be reasonable there for DLSS perhaps. But for PS5 games that originate on 9th gen hardware, probably not, probably 720p, maybe even below, who knows, but probably not a super high resolution there. For Nintendo's first-party efforts, I'd kind of speculate that maybe they'll lean towards a little bit higher on the resolution, a little bit simpler on the game content. that would certainly, I think, fit with their broader strategy there and possibly get development costs to a reasonable level, with some titles breaking that mold. But also there might be some concerns, like with UE5 at extremely low resolutions. What I've observed on devices like the Steam Deck is that when you get to very low resolutions with like 1/8 res lumen and stuff like this, you end up having a lot of noise and image incoherency with lumen. It doesn't really work that well at very low resolutions. So perhaps you would maybe prioritize higher internal resolutions, possibly at the cost of lowered output resolutions or lowered settings or things like that. I can imagine there might be a little bit of a balancing act there with respect to some of those settings there. But in general, I would assume that, yeah, a lot of games will be upscaling a DLSS output to the final output that you're targeting, whether that's 1800p or rather whether that's 1080p or 4K. I'd expect it to be more common in the docked mode, but also in the portable mode, I'd expect to see quite a bit of it, especially with more advanced titles and ports, the kind of impossible port kind of title that you'll see, I presume, quite a bit of on the Switch 2 there.
Mm-hmm. So, Tom, given that it's almost certain at this point that Switch 2 has a 1080p screen, DLSS has got to enter the conversation, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, there's no way around that. And I think we'll probably see a repeat of the strategy of the current Switch, where they'll optimize for that portable play first. And then the docked play will kind of be like, okay, we can, build around the portable experience and grow out from there. And I think the philosophy around the resolutions will go with that. So there are some exceptions like Smash Brothers, which I think really ran well at 1080p on the original Switch, performed really optimally. But yeah, with DLSS, it's an extra variable, and you're going to have two numbers floating about, the input and the output. And then the final output obviously would be 4K in most people's cases, I'd imagine, for most TVs nowadays. So yeah, it's going to be a balancing act for every developer to decide where they want to position those. Like I think we will see a lot of 720p, a lot of 540p even for really strenuous titles in portable mode, if they're using kind of the balanced DLSS to hit 1080p on that display. So yeah, we'll really have to wait and see. It will vary on a title by title basis, but yeah, it'd be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are gains by obviously using lower resolutions. Now, in handheld mode, I mean, obviously, I think there's going to be like an 8-inch screen. That's the hot rumor for Switch 2.
Right.
But, that's actually still relatively small, and it can still hide a multitude of evils. I mean, the Switch's screen is, we were looking at like 360p content quite a lot of times when we're dealing with really high-end stuff. Obviously, we had the classic situation with Ark Survival Evolved, where the first version was like, I think we measured 144p. I don't think the Switch screen saved that one, but I think they could absolutely use DLSS from 540p to 1080p. They could probably go to an intermediate resolution as well, like 900, and it would still look pretty good. So there's a lot of flexibility in handheld. Parts of the pipeline where it doesn't benefit, well, as I said, post-processing tends to be at native resolution. That could be a bit problematic. Mm-hmm. We're just going to have to wait and see. With that said, what we've seen of Switch 2 in terms of leak specs and whatnot, it does seem to have a decent amount of bandwidth for once, which is something that the prior model didn't really have. I guess the question is going to be, and it's always going to come down to this, the cost of DLSS once, especially in dock mode. I think that's something you pointed out, Oliver. There just could be limitations there, unless, of course, NVIDIA has developed a lightweight DLSS, which isn't beyond the realms of possibility. I think Hello Games did a lightweight FSR2 implementation for Switch. Yeah, so the concept of doing something similar there isn't beyond the realms of possibility. But I do think DLSS will be used consistently, simply because the demands of games are only getting higher. There's a lot of people doing Unreal Engine 5 games, and the Switch 2 isn't going to be, PS5 class horsepower, far from it, just by virtue of the fact it's a handheld device. Proof of the pudding is going to be in the tasting, as always. Okay, let's move on to the final question. This one comes from Scud. Hey chaps, super quick one. Do you think the Xbox handheld will just be next generation's Series S and the same deal for PlayStation's equivalent? Tom?
I think so. I think that's a fairly reasonable. It won't be matching. I don't think it's going to hit that level, but it'll be broaching that sort of spec. And especially when you dial it down to a smaller screen, it's going to be perceptibly quite similar to that sort of level of experience. Fewer graphics options, as we've seen on Series S, maybe one single way to play it. I can imagine, and a lower resolution, depending on what they're targeting. They're probably, let's assume 1080p display. So yeah, a lot of that will match up, and that's kind of scaling down from where 1440p is the target for Series S, kind of in an ideal scenario. It kind of raises a question about what developers will target, in terms of, the multi-plat games. If there's another, maybe sub-Series S hardware sort of point to target, and same with PlayStation as well. We can imagine that they're going to target something substantially lower than what we've got in PlayStation 5 in order to get that running on a, in terms of battery life on a mobile. So yeah, the developers have got to really balance that load between portable systems and the current ones, and we're probably going to be anchoring like the ambitions of game lower as a result because of that.
Right. I think there's two concepts here. The concept that there'll be two SKUs for the next generation, and then the concept that the lower end SKU, which is almost certainly going to be the handheld SKU, will have like Series S performance power. So from my perspective, I think that the lower end SKU will be the handheld SKU, but it probably won't be super, super cheap. And I also think that you may well have Series S class performance, but it will have more modern features. There's a lot of talk at the moment about the UDNA unified architecture that AMD is looking into and developing at the moment. So yeah, I think there'll be some sort of much stronger focus on ray tracing and machine learning than there is in the current Series S, but probable sort of raster performance at Series S level. That would be a really good target to hit, and still ambitious, I'd say. What would you say to that, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too sure about this. I think that if the next Xbox handheld leans on Windows in the way that we think it might, I don't know that it would necessarily map perfectly onto that Series S concept as a device that is a console that's basically getting guaranteed support and bespoke game versions over the course of the generation. It may be more like Steam Deck, where basically everything runs, but it's basically, your experience can be a bit inconsistent in that hardware. You might have to configure games yourself. And some developers might put special effort into getting lower settings for that device and having everything run well. Some developers may not. So I don't know. It could. There are a number of ways it could go there, but one way would be that more Steam Deck route, where it's really up to the end user and support is not necessarily guaranteed. Or maybe there's some kind of level of support that's guaranteed, but not the same level of for sure compatibility that you get with the Series S. For Sony, I don't know. I'm kind of two minds about it. On the one hand, they are really committed to console generations, it seems like. So you lean towards thinking that it would be a Series S style device and they would support it as the baseline console spec for the PS6 generation. I think that's probably the more likely possibility. But on the other hand, it's probably not going to have full PS5 game compatibility in all likelihood without games getting patches to support this new PS Portal device. PS Portable device, I should say, not PS Portal device. Obviously, we already have that. And that's kind of a bit of an awkward fit to me, at least. It might have full or close to full PS4 game compatibility because the spec should be capable of that. But the PS5 compatibility is kind of a question mark. And then I guess the question is, would it have full PS6 compatibility? I don't know. I would kind of lean towards yes if they are introducing this, let's say in 2 years or 3 years. Potentially alongside the new console, the PS6, or right before it. I think it makes a lot of sense to say, hey, this is our minimum spec console. Maybe you lose the high resolution support, you lose the 60 FPS modes to some degree, you lose the 120 FPS modes to some degree, but we're going to give you an experience where you get a portable version of your PS6 games. I think that's a compelling proposition. But at the same time, it's kind of a less than ideal fit with their existing PS5 console offering there. So I don't know if they would potentially consider the idea that we'll pitch this as a machine that runs many PS5 games and all PS4 games and some PS6 games. Would they go that route, or would they go all in and say this is a Series S-like machine that actually does support all of the contemporary software? I'm not totally sure which way they go with it. I'd probably lean more towards the latter if they are offering this as like a full-on big hardware offering, as opposed to something like the PS Portal, which is more of an accessory. I would kind of think they would go with that approach, that Series S-like approach for that console.
Yeah, I think it's going to be they're going to be scaled down versions of whatever the next generation hardware is, right? I think that's the bottom line. There's got to be commonality there. There's in order to introduce scalability. So the concept of a PS6 game running on the handheld is actually viable. So, you know, I'm fully expecting that the architecture of PlayStation 6 and whatever Xbox is coming up with is going to be very different to what it is today. I think there's going to be, you know, as I said, machine learning and ray tracing considerations built in. The question really is how it's going to tackle the existing digital libraries. I don't think they can put out a device that doesn't have support for their existing ecosystems. I think that's going to cause big problems for them. And that might be one of the reasons why we're having to wait so long for them, because, you know, I don't think the current generation of hardware could do that. Yeah, really interesting question. I do think there will be two SKUs. I do think one of them will be a handheld. The question is really the extent to which they're interoperable. I think they've got to be. And I think there's still this question mark over the whole digital library thing. If you've got like a PlayStation digital library and you can't play your PlayStation games on the handheld, on the one hand, I guess it could be, you know, people have seen that before with like the PSP and the Vita and whatnot. You start a new library, but I honestly think that you shouldn't need to at this point, you know, especially when you've got the ROG Ally doing a pretty good job of running PC games for the most part. So, I think the fact that we're waiting so long for these devices to come along is probably indicative of the fact that the technology just isn't there at the moment, but it will be at some point. Anyway, that was the final question, therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance that you did enjoy it. Please also consider the DF supporter program. Yeah, early access to everything we do, or a lot of things we do. Early access to the Direct. Weekly update on what we're up to, high quality downloads of each and every video, and a whole lot more besides. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching and indeed supporting Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next week.